I'd like to welcome everybody to our first proper Doug style meeting that we've done virtually without a public meeting beforehand. Tim will not be with us personally, but he has recorded an introduction, which I'll show shortly, but we'll do some introductions. I think if we go around the virtual table by organisation, I'll call out the organisation and your name and your title. And anyone that doesn't belong to an organisation that I've named will mop up afterwards. So we'll start from the top because we've got Barclays. You're muted, Guy. Got no sound.
All right.
There you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Guy Lansley. I work at Barclays at the Data and Analytics Centre of Excellence. And I used to come to these meetings a few years ago when I was based at UCL. So it's good to be back.
We have Cloud Factory. We don't have Cloud Factory yet. Co-op. No one from the co-op?
Hi, I'm Abby.
Abby.
I'm muted all. Hey, yeah, I'm from the co-op. I work in the location planning and property team. I think Chris Brown usually joins, but he was busy today, so I've stepped in his place. I only joined the co-op about a year ago, so I'm very new to all this. So I just thought it'd be interesting to listen in and join in.
And
my name's Josh. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm also from the co-op as well. Same position as Abby, really. I started about a year ago. Hoping to just listen in today and then hopefully learn something new.
And Exasol.
Helena, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Helena Schwenk. I work for Exasol. They're a tech vendor, an analytics database, but my role there is actually to work within the Chief Data and Analytics Office. It's a relatively new post for me. I've been working there in the office for just over a month. Graham?
Yep, so Graham Sharp. I've been with Exasol now since February, so it's not 5 months or so. I'm the director for the strategic solutions, which basically means I'm always looking for new and innovative ways for our existing as well as future customers to get the best out of the Exasol database, to make the most of what they've purchased, and help them move towards the future.
GSK.
Stuart?
Yep. No problem. So yeah, Stuart Power. I guess I'm responsible for Graham and Helena, being on this call today. So it's kind of my relationship with Doug that brings Exasol here today. So welcome and looking forward to hearing from you all.
GSK.
Hi, Mark Bass from GSK. Well, am I supposed to be adding something else, Jan?
We've got a Mark, but I don't know which Mark it is. So should we go to Ladbrokes?
Yes, I'm here from Ladbrokes. end-to-end now. It's changed a lot since I've joined. So I'm working as a senior business intelligence analyst there in Mark's team. So started joining the calls last year at the start of lockdown, and I've enjoyed them since.
Mark? The Mark that we have on the screen is either GSK or Ladbrokes. We'll find out later. So,
Hi, Mark Bass.
Oh.
Hi, Mark Bass from GSK. I head up the analytics team in the UK pharma part of the business.
Thanks, Mark. Sainsbury's. I was from Sainsbury's. Sainsbury's. I saw.
Yeah, he just had his internet just went as you said Sainsbury's.
Sainsbury's.
Sainsbury's, yeah, sorry, that was Jan. Everything froze then. My network dropped out. Yeah, Ian Sterling from Sainsbury's. Work in the property team in the analytics and insight team. That's me. I've been coming here forever, I think.
Tesco's. I'm not sure we've got anyone from Tesco's. Whitbread.
Unmute. Sorry. Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Binns. I'm the I work effectively in sort of some of the product management and data governance areas at Whitbread. However, my wider team also includes a bunch of BI reporting specialists and data scientists and pricing analysts, etc. I'm here representing Whitbread. Lorraine Johnson, the other attendee from Whitbread, cannot make it today. She's in the property function and does a lot of the GIS analytics. So, good morning.
And anyone else I've missed out? Anastasia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Anastasia.
You're very quiet.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Anastasia, and I'm working for Luminance. Very new to data analytics, so I'm just learning all about it. And so that's very interesting.
And Anastasia is in helping Doug with our social media presence. Map Action.
Good morning. My name is Juan Duarte. I'm the technical director for Map Action and joining as a guest. Very good to meet you. Thank you.
So, apart from Doug reps, have I missed anybody out? Sasha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I'm Sasha. I'm actually a apprentice for a data talk. I'm just joining today to listen in and hopefully learn a couple of things. It's lovely to see it's lovely to see you all.
You work with Tim, don't you?
Yeah, I do. He's really nice to work with.
Gary?
Hey all, I think I've met most people now. So Gary Cole, Lumilinks, we're a data science business. My business partner's Tim, and hence why I volunteer for Doug and help coordinate and support Jan in the work that we do and aspire to do going forward.
Martin?
Yes, I'm Martin Callingham. I'm a bit of a dinosaur, I'm afraid, as my grey hair shows. I was a founding member of about 100 years ago, and I have been running since retirement around the block, really, to try and keep myself thin, unable, but no, seriously, I've been running one of the Doug courses, which I shall be talking about today.
Have I missed anybody? Shout. Right, so I'm Jan Wright. I'm a co-director with Tim of Doug and administrator, and hoping that this meeting goes as well as I'm hoping it will. So we'll move on. As I said before, Tim couldn't make it, but he did record his piece. So I'll just share my screen.
Hi everybody. Sorry for good sort of what's the phrase? I'm trying to think of the appropriate film. If you're reading, listening, or watching this, then it means I'm not with you, which is a bit of a shame. But it sort of gives me the opportunity to give you a bit of an update and how we're trying to manage the current situation. As you know, my domestic situation has become somewhat more complicated with my wife's ill health. Some of you old timers may remember back 2 conferences ago when it was becoming apparent something was not quite right, when I had to leave the conference at the end urgently because my wife was in hospital. At that point, we weren't aware of what was going on, but suffice to say now she has a metastatic cancer in her pelvis, and has meant that she's lost a lot of mobility, but thankfully the progress is slow. Anyway, what that means is that most that I taking on caring duties become somewhat unpredictable, and also will find it somewhat difficult to commit to being at things that are very far away from St Ives, my home base. And so we've come up with this opportunity to continue to contribute to the meetings even whilst I'm not with you physically. In some ways, as you can imagine, this whole dreadful situation with the lockdown and the pandemic has actually made us realise that some of these things are possible, whereas actually 2 years ago, if this had occurred, probably none of us would have thought of actually trying to carry something on remotely. But having us all had 18 months now of it, just about, it seems not quite so impractical. So here we are. So as things stand, most of the time I will do things remotely, certainly probably while you're meeting in London. Given when we have meetings in Peterborough, I may well be able to make it, although again, might have to decline at short notice. And Jan, in her inestimable wisdoms, came up with this suggestion of me pre-recording some contributions, which if I'm then not able to make it, she will use as my input into the current discussions. So any questions, please by all means get in touch, and I'll try and clarify things, and we'll find a way to make this work. So that's, if you like, so the internal news, and then I thought I'd give you some thoughts. One of which is just about external data news, and this is I'm on the some of you may know, on the Origin and Destination Working Party at the ONS, as ever, carrying on Doug's long tradition of providing some commercial inputs into the generation, extraction and distribution of public data. And it was, again, particularly pertinent. As you know, Keith, my predecessor, one of his final legacies was to make sure that commercial organisations were recognised as being able to provide benefits for the public good. And as such, that meant that we were able to access secure data. And of course, you may have forgotten, we did the census earlier on in March this year, and so things are building up for the new census data to be made available to the wider public. And nowadays things have moved on from 2011, in that they are going to have a threefold set of distribution. There's going to be public open data that's allowed from the census, then what they call safeguarded, and third, what they call secure. They very much adopted the model that CDRC was certainly one of the pioneers of, this 3-stage level of data. So the public open data anybody can have, and you can do anything you wish. Safeguarded data you have to have under license and guarantee various controls of the data, and there's a certain level of disclosure control applied to it. And then there's the secure level data, which is much more granular and adjusted and allows you to have direct access to much more detailed information, but you have to do it within what are now called, well, secure locations. It used to be the case that they were just ONS offices down in London, Titchfield and Newport, and then they provided a place in Glasgow and Northern Ireland. Thankfully, they've now extended those secure locations to include what are called safe pods, which will be dotted. There are going to be 25 of them dotted around the country. I'm hoping that most of them will be at universities. And this was where I was able to contribute something only yesterday, in that they were forgetting yet again. We need to constantly remind them that commercial people are now approved researchers, and as a result can contribute. And I'm hoping, as I've directly impacted, we'll have the opportunity to have access to safeguarded data under specific licensed conditions. So more of that. But what it does bring to mind is the idea that some of you may want to consider going through the process of becoming an approved researcher. I know some of you have already done it. I'm fairly sure Tim Rain at Sainsbury's has. I'm not sure anybody else. But as the census is becoming available, this will be a particularly appropriate time when you'll get access as a approved researcher to much more detailed information coming out of the census. You of course do it under very controlled conditions, but that allows you to look at the data and then create approved outputs, which go through the whole process of statistical disclosure control. But the important thing is that you can look at the data prior to that disclosure control, then creating your own outputs for that purpose, rather than only looking at the data after it's been made distinctly anonymous. So I'm excited by the new opportunities with the origin and destination data. They're also looking at providing us with much more flexible access, in that they've talked for, well, it must be 20 years now, on providing a flexible downloading tool that allows you to select the different tables you want to construct. Now they're very close to actually delivering it, so that will give us lots of scope. And but even now, they've got the fallback position of providing with static data. And as you know, origin destination data is one of my particular fascinations, because of the connections it shows across the country and how things can propagate. But there may well be lots of other information that's of particular interest to yourselves. And the more granular are, the more you can set it to your own catchment areas. So that's the external area. And then I thought it wouldn't do any harm if I gave you the benefits of some of my current speculation. You're more than welcome to switch off if you think I'm just going off on one again. And now I'll maybe confirm the fact that you want to switch off by relating it to an event I had a few days ago. You may know I and my wife Joanne keep 3 what I think are beautiful Irish setters, quite large dogs who like a lot of walking. But we also have a cat, Arthur, black and white, who sort of manages to navigate his way around them. He outwits them all the time, which is the thing that I really like about him. But none of our pets are particularly confrontational. They all like to sort of find their ways around people. It would have made our life easier if just for once Arthur the cat has stood his ground, bopped a few of them on the nose, and then they would have stayed well clear of him. But he's always chosen to work his way around them. Anyway, I was returning from walking the 3 dogs, and Arthur had decided to sit outside the front door when normally he goes in the back door. And we were trying to encourage him to go through the front door. And it suddenly prompted me to think, wise as Arthur is, can he work out that because 3 red dogs who look something like the normal people that inhabit our house are sat outside the front door, but actually that means that there are no dogs inside the house. So if he goes in the front door now, he doesn't have to sort of run the gauntlet. Or is he just going through the front door because behind him are these 3 red dogs, and the only way out or away actually is to go through this open front door, and it's better to risk getting away with it in the house because I know there's 3 hairy things outside rather than going through it. And as I say, it intrigued me as to what level of thought was going through the cat brain, and was the cat brain able to make that logical deduction. And as I moved on, I thought about whether and where our own analysis works, and I'll tell you why I'm thinking about this. I mentioned a while ago I read a fascinating book. It's called Radical Uncertainty. It's one of the authors is Mervyn King, ex head of the Bank of England, and he was talking about how reliance on standard statistical analysis can get us into a lot of quite a bit of a mess sometimes, predominantly because we're overconfident with it, because if we just look at the data from a statistical point of view, we'll nearly always miss things that could happen because they're outside the model, and we nearly always underestimate the uncertainty in the data, because some of the things are uncertain because the model wants to change. And so he was arguing for the need for us to always be in a position where we're exercising judgment. We're trying to understand what's going on, was his phrase, and some of that doesn't sit well with if you like the statistical approach of just taking probabilities and multiplying them together. It relies too often at some point on the fact of independence, which creates lots of overconfidence. And he developed this talk of looking at narratives. He used the analogy, which I've done myself before, of looking at the way a courtroom comes to a decision about what's going on when they decide what's whether someone's guilty or not. And the way they describe it is that they look, and we naturally look in other circumstances which are not statistical, for what we think is the best explanation of what's happening, and that's what it does. Is two things. It takes very clearly the need for a sequence of different events, something which a statistical method ignores quite a lot, because it just assumes that things happen randomly a lot of the time. And it talks about those things that might be rare and exceptional and singular. And that's where I think where it becomes quite important when we're trying to understand what might be happening when it's happening not very often. So, and lots of things are happening not very often, and we're asked to come up with a judgment of where things are. And he talks about narrative analysis, and I think it's a good thing for us to stop and ask ourselves sometimes. I've certainly got into that habit of thinking first, what might be going on? How are we sort of blinding ourselves from other influences, other sources of uncertainty, because we focus just on the techniques and easily end up just staring at a problem from the point of view of what we know we can analyze, rather than staring at a problem and allowing anything that might be happening to occur. As I say, that's why I went back to the cats, and why you might want to think yourselves about the problems and thinking, well, what things might be impacting on this scenario that I've not taken account of at all? It might be the weather. It might be the fact that somebody's ill. I think, for example, about how we, and I go back to my own personal circumstances, how we treat behavior of customers, for example, as if all that's going on is that they're considering the transaction with your own organization, and forget that the transactions are impacted on all sorts of other choices. As with the cat, because the things happened outside the door, things inside are no longer happening. As with myself, because of my home situation, it's impacting a lot on what's happening at work. And those things are outside any normal model. I could ramble on. I'm not going to do that. I'm sure there's all sorts of much more immediately useful things to do today, and I hope you have a great conversation. Unfortunately, this time without me. I will wish you all the best and speak to you later. Thank you. Bye.
Let's do a cage rattle. Martin, Bellingham, would you like to stimulate everyone the way you usually do, and get some people moaning, not about this video, about something else, please?
Right, well, this section of the meetings used to be an open discussion on whatever was bugging someone at the time. It generally helps to prime people to think about what's bugging them, because there are so many that it's difficult to select one to actually throw into an open discussion. Can anyone have something on the top of their mind that happened yesterday or the week before, which you'd like people to discuss with you?
I think one thing we've seen recently, so our kind of job is we work closely with promotions. So promotions are obviously trying to spend money, and we're on the opposite side. We're trying to make them spend it correctly and spend it appropriately to try and make money from it. And it's kind of constantly do stuff. Okay, this was wrong. Can we learn something from this? They have somebody in their head, it's just wrong. And then 6 months down the line, they ask the exact same question that we said, can we not do this again? And this just cycle just repeats every 6 months. And then you're just kind of banging your head. It's like, can we learn from this, guys?
I noticed some people nodding to that problem, perhaps.
Well, I think it generally is in the world of, in our case in Whitbread, obviously we're running with some of the lowest room rates we have done in years to sort of stimulate the market back up again and sort of get the country moving again after the pandemic. The flip side of it is insight into the hotels industry. You make cheap hotel rooms and at the risk of being a little bit divisive here, you do begin to attract rather an unsavory customer. So which is leading to quite a lot of issues in our hotels, police being called, damage being caused, that sort of thing. So normally for those of you who maybe aren't regular customers of ours, in the budget hotel chain sector, we are probably one of the pricier ones. So we generally don't see a lot of that sort of activity. Are still offering great value every day, obviously, but at the same time, we don't normally sort of attract a lot of that custom. So we're kind of suffering a little bit. We've been very successful in terms of restoring a lot of our markets on the back of these sort of room rate promotions. Thankfully, unlike Owen, we don't get into a 6-month cycle on this, but I think we're hoping to get out the other side of this and go, thank God we don't need to sell those really cheap room rates again like we used to about 5-10 years ago. So.
Anything else? Any other burning issues, or is everything quiet on the home front with everyone?
I've got one that's quite topical. So I personally work with a lot of banking transaction data. We do this primarily for insights for government and internal stuff. One of the things that's been growing over the last few years has been sort of buy now, pay later type of transactions, like Klarna, for instance. And it's increasingly difficult to shift your analysis in a temporal sense towards, number one, working what sort of transactions these are, but also working out what they're displacing as well, and trying to isolate them. So yeah, I've just spent the last couple of weeks trying to basically remodel all of these buy now, pay now payments. It's pretty tricky.
Anybody got similar solutions or solutions to that, or had similar experiences to that? And here we have the brains of the world all together. Put all that collective onto your problem. This has never happened.
Yeah, I don't think we've got the brains of the world here, Martin, but we've got some brains.
How about maybe a more open one? Do we think that data and analytics has played a proper role in the whole COVID? The science behind the actions that the government's taken. Now there's always a science guy stood next to Boris on the 6 o'clock news, but from what I can tell, there's very little of the actions taken that's been related to the actual data. What do you think? Have we learned from this program?
Well, forgive me, I've not noticed. I couldn't remember the name of the speaker we had in one of the last Doug sessions from University of Cambridge, but I think he was much more eloquent about the use of data and with the government and with some of the public announcements than I could possibly be. All I can say from a corporate and from a commercial perspective, I think as a business, I'm firmly of the opinion you need your analysts when things are going badly, way more than you need them when things are going well. When you're making money and you hand over fist, you kind of want to know why, but you're not too bothered about it because you're making loads of money. When you can't make money or it's a bit more of a struggle, that's when you need your analysts the most. So I know at Whitbread, you know, our BI reporting team, our data scientists, our, you know, pricing analysts and such like have never been busier.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's the speed that you can actually process your data with it to get. I think that's increased, hasn't it? The demand on us to produce results faster has just got harder and harder, and faster and faster.
You're slightly quiet, Graham.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it in a previous Doug meeting, but you know, quite a lot of our organisations will look at, you know, recent trends to help us sort of forecast the short to medium term future in whatever it is we're doing. When, in my case, hotel occupancy and revenues generated, etc. But I'm sure it's different for all of you. Of course, we've got a big hole in our history, which has actually driven sort of quite a lot of data-led, data science style approaches to sort of fill that hole and almost forecast what could have, should have happened to make sure that we've got all that short, medium-term forecasting in place to be able to run the business going forwards. Now, we've been quite effective in that space, but I know that has actually caught out a number of large organizations who are just so used to having that trading history to refer to.
Does that mean that you've had to learn new techniques and methodologies to make that happen, to do that forecasting? Is that something you've never done before?
I wouldn't say it'd be a case of learning new techniques at Whitbread, because I think some of the techniques are fairly embedded, but you know, having to rely so heavily on a forecast, I think, is the interesting one. I think most of the time forecasts are used to sort of track against sort of the actuals to get a feel for, you know, how well the business is doing, how good the forecasters are, etc. It's quite unprecedented that you only have a forecast to work with.
But do you feel that your team department is now more valued by the rest of the business? Has your relationship changed at all because of that?
Interesting question. I you know, it's funny actually. I've never felt that the analytics teams within Whitbread aren't valued enough. I think sometimes whether or not they are resourced well enough or technology invested well enough to support them, that's previously been a challenge. That seems to be a lot less of a challenge. I wouldn't like to naturally assume that that is because they are now seen as more valuable, but one would like to think so.
Because you were saying earlier that you're involved in loads and loads of different projects because there is new spend on IT. Are they data related specifically, or everything?
Yeah, basically. But you know, some of that's not all just to do with sort of data and analytics. Some of that is around sort of recognizing that as a large organization, and there'll be a number of them on the call who have been trading for, well, we're 1870 something. So, you know, albeit some of our IT systems, I think, do date back that long. But, you know, we're recognizing that we're in a position we need to put our house in order. Like probably a number of the large supermarkets have done with some of their COBOL-based systems that were originally developed in the 60s. They probably only got around to doing those in the 90s or the early 2000s. You know, we're going through a number of different transitions like that, as well as sort of data and analytics-led projects. So it would be, like I say, it'd be wrong to attribute it just to data and analytics, but there is certainly a need to drag the whole IT kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
Thank you. Right, thanks Martin for stimulating that while I sent the video off to Gary. You've got that video. I'll leave you to play.
Yeah, I'll go off screen for a little bit, try and get it working.
Thank you. Right, okay, moving on. Exasol. So Graham, would you like to
Yep, so let me share my screen.
Could you turn your sound up very slightly because you're quite faint?
Sound. Just hang on.
Sometimes one can just lean forward.
Yeah, bring your mic forward.
Maybe that's better, is it?
Yes, it is better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's give it a go. And you can see my screen now, hopefully?
Yes.
Yep. So, yeah, quick intro to me. I've been at Exasol for 5 months, but prior to Exasol, I spent 22 years with Adidas, hence the clothes, because I don't have any others. Yeah, here in Germany, I'm down in Bavaria near Nuremberg. I've always been in data related roles, so managing BI teams or analytics teams. Yeah, been around the world, worked with all the different departments, finance, supply chain, you name it. So fair to say I've seen the good, the bad and the ugly of everything that data and analytics has to throw at us. Yeah, I think, I mean, if I look at the highlights, building the consumer DNA factory, the last 5 years at Adidas, and watching their e-com business grow from nothing to 4.5 billion over the last 5 years. And the analytics that we provided played a huge part over that. Anyhow, not enough about me. The data lakehouse, that's why we're here today, to talk about the hype around it as much as anything. Really, this is a topic that we at Exasol had to have a look at because no one really knew what we were talking about. The term data lakehouse started to crop up an awful lot in the last 6 months. And we were sat looking at ourselves saying, well, what does it really mean? What are we talking about? So hopefully, yeah, let's go through and try and understand what it is and try and give us a description of where we're going. So we'll talk about the data lakehouse. There's 2 scenarios that I'll put in front of you. We'll describe those. We'll have a look at what are the problems behind the lakehouse. We'll say why are we even talking about it in the first place? Why is it trending? Why is it at such a hype at the moment? Maybe look at the alternatives, when to use it and when not to use it. And then we'll try and answer the question at the end, should it be part of your analytics strategy? So let's jump right in. What is a data lakehouse? Well, I'll go back. Let's look at the history first. So the data lake itself, that term was coined back in 2010. James Dixon, CTO of Pentaho. That's a very widely accepted term now. But the lakehouse, that only came up in about 2016. So it has been around a while, but it hasn't been talked about as much. There's actually a guy called Pedro Javier Gonzalez Alonso, obviously liked names and created the lakehouse as a new term as part of his thesis. Yeah, back in 2016. So it's taken a bit of a while to come forward, but probably one of the reasons is it's now being used very much as a marketing term by the companies that are using it. So the first scenario is very much related to Amazon and their AWS stack, so that their web services world. So whenever Amazon talk about the lakehouse, they're talking about the tools that they offer that sit around and above the lake. So right in the middle there, the picture, you've got the typical S3. Hopefully most of you are aware of that platform. That's the raw data lake where you're throwing in, your bucket loads of data, everything you can get your hands on. You're throwing it into the lake and storing it there. And then Amazon has a plethora of tools that they then make available that sit above that lake. So in that diagram, you can see, you've got even 3 different types of database. There's one for every use case. So you've got Aurora for OLTP type, transaction processing world. You've got Redshift for the more analytical side of things, OLAP capabilities. You've got DynamoDB as the NoSQL tool, which is great for streaming data into at a fast rate. And you got, then you've got tools like SageMaker, the machine learning world of Amazon. And they've got thin dotted lines, even on this is the Amazon diagram themselves. So you've got kind of this thin dotted line between them, which tends to indicate that, that these tools are linked, but it's a weak link. Typically, to move data between two of these tools, you've got to export your data as a CSV file, send it back down to the data lake, and then re-import it back into one of the other tools. Very rarely do you have the ability to move data directly between the tools. So Amazon's calling their lakehouse architecture this collection of tools that sit above the lake. So that's one option we've got, one version of the lakehouse. The other version, which is perhaps more interesting for us, is the Databricks version. Databricks is a company that it came from the original creators of the Apache Spark platform out in California. So you have these group of people working on this open Apache Spark world. Once that was up and running, they then gave that to the world and moved on to create Databricks, the company. So very much a financial opportunity for them to make money out of what they'd created in terms of this open Spark platform. So of course, from a Databricks point of view, their core direction is to bring everything they possibly can back towards this Spark-based world of processing. So you can see in the diagram there, over time, you've had the data warehouse, we've had the data lake coming in from 2010 onwards. And what Databricks are now trying to do, and have quite successfully done, is create this additional layer on top of the lake. I don't know if you can see my mouse there, but in this right-hand part of the diagram, we've got this it's like the surface of the lake, if you like, where they're doing additional level of processing, and they've created an additional layer of abstraction, if you like, which allows them to then create even more tools based on Spark that can talk to this surface layer, in theory, without having to take the data out of the lake. So the benefits, that Databricks guys are saying is that they solve a couple of the problems that were associated with your typical data warehouse and also with the data lake. So the argument against the data warehouse is that it has a schema and it's very, very structured and therefore can't handle all the unstructured data that typically is now sitting in a data lake. So the images, the text, the voice files, those kind of unstructured data that is perhaps more and more becoming useful in the world of machine learning, for example. It's traditionally that's not a strong part of data warehouse. And on the other side, you've got the data lake, which is messy. Yeah, it completely lacks structure of any kind, typically leading to your data swamp. And that old question, well, I've got a data lake, I've got all my data in it, but now what? So there's that gap in the middle that Databricks is trying to fill with this surface layer, if you like. But one thing to look at, if you look at any of the data coming from, or the documents coming from Databricks, they never ever mention analytical warehouses, which we'll come to that later. So another way of looking at that is down at the bottom, you've got your data lake. There's no schemas involved. So it's a schema on read process. up at the top, you've got your classical data warehouse, which is schema on right. So you're bringing the structure, you're bringing the data together in a format that makes it very easy and very quick to analyze and access. And then going for this version in the middle, which is the so-called flexible schema. So they're not going all the way towards the full relational database, but they are for sure creating a layer of cleaned up and relational data on top of your typical lake. And that's typically pushing your data into, you know, one of the formats on that right hand side, the Parquet or Avro type format for your file, which is, you know, basically saying, yes, we've realized that data lakes are great, but there's no way you're going to get the performance and the speed that you need to analyze this data unless we at least take one step towards cleaning up the data and putting it in a format that we can access and process quickly. So for me, that's the only real difference. It's this extra layer that they're creating. So let's have a look at what that really looks like in terms of speed and performance and costs. So on the left-hand side of the diagram here, you've got the pure lake, and the colours are supposed to represent the speed of access, the ease of access, and the performance that you're going to get from the different options. And the pictures at the bottom are just a way of trying to show that as well. So, you know, the deep lake is perhaps, you know, in terms of speed, it's the old mainframe, big tape machines. Don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that. I certainly am, but there you go. And then we've got this new surface layer sitting on top of that, still Spark based, still in your lake, but it's cleaned up and it is formatted. It is relational to a degree. If you pull the data out of the lake into a tool like Amazon Redshift or Azure SQL, it's getting quicker. It's always going to be quicker. You're now adding that full OLTP capability or NoSQL if it's MongoDB, something like that. So you're getting it faster. You've added another level of capability, if you like. So we're moving from the CD type world of the cold surface lake to the DVD or the SSD disk world, if you like. But the downside of that is that we're moving to proprietary formats. You know, as soon as you pull the data out of the lake, you're putting it into a format that's specific to the supplier, whether it's Google, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Amazon. And then if you really want to go for the fast and the pure performance level, then you're going for an analytics database, which is, you know, the real hot, quick data. And that's where, you know, that's in memory. So your RAM picture there is a good indication of the speed that you're going to get there. It's the fastest you're going to possibly get. And it's got all those nice column-based capabilities. It's MPP, all those nice things. So the other version of looking at that is from a complexity point of view. If the arrow is going the other way in this case, so the complexity is increasing as we're pushing the data down. So if you're working on the deep lake, you're working in command line code, very, very basic. And it's the same if you're on the surface at the moment. When the cloud technology came in, it was based on the back of Hadoop. And for me, that was a backward step certainly in the technology world, because we've been on this path towards low code and GUI based tools which really made a huge difference in terms of connecting to business and getting business people involved and giving them self-service capabilities. And then all of a sudden we went for this cloud-based, Hadoop-based capability, and we went back to almost, assembly language kind of world. Everything was really, really complicated again. So again, on the other side of that line, when we get into proper relational databases and we start using SQL again, we're going back towards that low code and ease of use. Especially when we get to the high end, then these databases available these days are completely self-tuning. You don't need a database administrator even. So benefits, performance, complexity, yeah, it's a big picture, and we're going to really look into that. And that brings us why is this topical and trending at the moment? I think a lot of the reasons behind that you can see here. So first part is really the failure of Hadoop to deliver scalable computing capability. So the storage side, which is why it was created in the first place, was fine. But as soon as you try to do anything with the data that you store, you really hit problems because of that complexity side. So that brought along, the public clouds, the AWS cloud, these Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and they've been a huge success because they've taken away the complexity of the Hadoop world. Azure and Google are still based on Hadoop. AWS is based on something very similar, their S3 world, but it's all hidden from you. It's very, very simple, and it's incredibly cheap. So that, I think it was something like 2.1 cents per gigabyte per month to store data in AWS. So that's been a huge success. But again, that's brought the problem of everyone's thrown the data into the cloud and they've not considered the cost of actually accessing and using that data. So as soon as you've gone down that path of migrating everything to the cloud, great. The costs of using the cloud, computing in the cloud, suddenly start to get astronomically high. You start to ramp up, and your volumes start to get big. A lot of companies that we're talking to, and I certainly saw this at Adidas, you're spending millions. The storage cost is nothing, but the compute cost is incredibly high. And it's very, very difficult to forecast. It's very, very, very difficult to follow, to know what you're to track what you're using. Another side is that there are very few options at the top in terms of the analytical database world. There really are only two real options: Exasol and Snowflake. The rest of the options out there, if we talk about Redshift, if we talk about Azure, they're all tools that were ported from traditional on-premise systems to the cloud. So Redshift was bought from PowerXL. It's a port of the old Postgres SQL 8 database. And that was a pure attempt by Amazon to shift away from Oracle, because to Amazon, Oracle was always known as Big Red. And that's why it's called Redshift. They just wanted to shift consumers away from Oracle. They used any means they could. Azure is the same. Azure SQL is based on the Microsoft SQL Server family, related services around it. So they're just ports from traditional existing on-premise solutions to the cloud. And that means they're always going to be a little bit restricted in terms of performance and not pure breadth. And then you've got this drive of the Apache open community as well behind all this. So, this desperation, there's a community that is really, really bought into the whole Apache Spark world. and they're driving that whole capability as fast as they possibly can. So what does that mean? Well, in terms of, is and when the Lakehouse the right choice? Maybe a couple of things that we can look at that will help us determine if that's going to be good for us. Elasticity. If you're in a position where you only do big jobs on an irregular basis and you only need that computing power every now and again, then maybe it's a good choice. Pay for what you use. Don't have this massive big system that is sat idle most of the time. The connectivity part, if you bought into a particular cloud vendor or whatever, it might be that using all their tools together is going to give you a benefit because of the connectivity. But as we saw with Amazon, that connectivity doesn't tend to be there at the moment. If you're really bothered about redundancy of your data and you really only want to store it once and never pull it out from your lake and put it into a proprietary, fast and performant technology, then fine, the lake's for you. So down at the bottom there, we've got the two options. Maybe that's one way of trying to put a black and white version on it. If your analytics is one time and very focused on a very small part of your business, then maybe the Lakehouse is good for you. But if you're doing standard and repeatable topics and analytical jobs all the time, 24/7, maybe you want to be going the other way and having an analytics database. You're going to have to fit it to what your data and analytics strategy is. But maybe there's a case for both together. Let's have a look at the diagram. Hopefully this makes sense to you. So let's see what we've got down at the bottom. We've got our data sources, typical enterprise data sources, SAP, Microsoft Navision, all your social media and your web data. You're throwing that all into your data lake. Bottom. On the top of the data lake, we've got this structured layer that we've talked about. That's now in Parquet format, possibly, or one of those new formats. And this is where Databricks and a couple of other players are in the market. So they're bringing the data and using the data from this additional surface layer, which is, but it's always going to be based on this open technology. So it's never going to be all pervasive. It's never going to cover your entire traditional data warehouse. You're going to be working in smaller chunks of data. And these guys are saying they're giving you the speed and the capability of actually working in a more proprietary format. Got to try that out for yourselves and check the numbers directly. They never stack up because it's physically not possible. If we go back to that diagram with the RAM, picture of the RAM and the picture of this DVD player, it's that story. You cannot process files as fast as you can process stuff that's in memory. So these guys all have so the Databricks and that, they always have this in-memory caches to speed things up, but those caches are always going to be limited in size. So what we typically see is, and maybe what a good alternative is to use your Databricks as your layer to handle the lake, to provide the metadata around the lake and to answer that question, I've got my lake, what's in it? So it gives you a structure around your lake. And then you still need perhaps a pure play analytics database on top to give you the power and the performance that's going to drive your analytics for your business at the speed that they really require and at the volume that they really require. So I've used Amazon as the example there with Amazon Glue, Redshift, and there's different scenarios. You know, whether you would use Exasol is obviously the analytics database I've used in this example, and you can use it as an accelerator, cloud data warehouse, or a pure play analytics database. But in each case, you're going to want to sit it on top of either your lake, Databricks, possibly even Redshift, because it's going to give you the speed above that as well. But it's two very separate things. The lake house is just wedge in the middle, if you like. It's giving you an extra option to speed things up over the pure lake itself. But one thing to take away is it's never going to be as fast as the layer on top. So yeah, so to answer the question, should a lakehouse be part of your analytics strategy? Well, the answer is, of course, I'm not going to say yes or no. It's maybe. There is no silver bullet at the moment to answer the question about how to handle the data in your lake, and what's the best alternative and what's the best solution for giving you the right volumes, the right speed, at the right cost, and the right simplicity. Maybe that hybrid solution is going to be the best of both worlds for some time to come. I just say, keep an open mind and consider all your options. So that's all I've got to say. Hopefully we've got some time for some questions, and hopefully I can give you some answers.
Great, thanks, Graham. Is there anyone got any questions?
Well, I've got some points I'd like to make. Thank you, Graham. Actually, I won't lie. I started that presentation hearing data lakehouse, thinking here's yet another buzzword and some like funky term they want to use in the data science space, and actually came at the end of it and actually went, okay, that's quite good. I understand what he's bringing to that. So no, thank you, Graham. I think sorry,
that was my main point. It's this hype and no one understanding it, and I'm on this kind of evangelical path to try and clear everyone's heads about what it actually means. Sorry, go on, carry on.
Yeah, no, it's because that was quite useful in framing a few things. Just for the purposes of context, Whitbread, we've got everything Azure in the cloud. We do have a structured data warehouse built from a lot of the data we're sort of storing in our data lake. So we have a structured data sets and all the right sort of visualization tools on that. But then we also have Databricks acting in the sort of way that you describe, sitting over that same sort of data lake of data, which gets built into the structured data warehouse to offer us some of those more advanced capabilities. And let's be honest with you, whilst, I maybe like a few other people on the call, a bit more long in the tooth, maybe might look at some of this stuff and go, oh God, this is racing ahead really fast. And it is racing ahead really fast. It is so powerful. And, the ability to use some of that unstructured data, text analytics and image analytics, the ability to run 500 different styles of regression models in about 5 minutes, which would otherwise have taken you in the old days when I was doing them with Martin on the call. That would probably take you a good couple of weeks to run that many. And so it's very powerful, and it is raising the profile of the analyst. I just wanted to just flag that it's easy to go shiny new technology. Oh my God, what can all us old analysts bring to the party? And I think there's a couple of things which have really struck me seeing data science sort of taking off within Whitbread. I think number one, data scientists start to focus a lot more on how they're doing things rather than what it is they're trying to do and the so what as the outcome. And a certain wise man in this call, Mr. Martin Callingham, who used to be my boss, said to me, the stakeholder won't care about how you've done that analysis. They'll just want to know it's done properly. What does it mean? But you are finding increasingly in the data science community, they're getting obsessed with their deep forest clusters or whatever it is this week. And the how isn't actually important. It's about how reliable the outcome is. So I think that's a mantra that still needs to be driven and managed quite carefully in this sort of circle. I think the second thing is around sort of that dirty word of governance, really, which is something I'm quite hot on. But in the specifics of sort of data science, I've reflected on the fact that, yeah, whilst everything is cheap to store in the cloud, you're absolutely right, Graham, it's quite expensive to compute it. But the more people that you're driving to do that, you're suddenly having to build in this governance layer that sort of basically helps throttle the everyone's usage to make sure the budget doesn't go through the roof. And this is something data scientists don't want to do. They're more sort of free jazz players. They don't want to work with constraints. They want to just get on and do things. They don't want to have to work within the constraints of verse, chorus, verse, chorus. So, you know, you're almost finding, you know, elements of policing or self-policing of varying levels of success within the data science environment, not least as well about having to sort of challenge on questions of data quality. It's great that you can go to the data lake and construct data in a really quick way, in a much more flexible way. But often this is to the degradation of overall data quality, which is normally much more managed in a structured data warehouse. So which then comes back to that sort of what that Martin used to drum into me when I was a young analyst, is if you're building these insights on shifting sands because you've constructed it from a data lake, so therefore it's not as high data quality as the data warehouse, you know, where are you? You know, so you have to be constantly challenging these sort of themes to ensure that your data scientists are creating the right stuff. But just like death and taxes, change is inevitable, and this is the change, and it is powerful. It's about how can we ride on the back of the data science boom, but ensure that it's not done without that focus on the output and the quality of the performance of the individuals and the quality of the performance of the systems.
Absolutely, totally agree with everything you said. I mean, it raises, if you look at it from that point of view of self-service capabilities, I think the data science world is moving rapidly. I think the times of pure data scientists is rapidly coming to an end. I think the need for business analysts with the ability to do data science, even if they don't know they're doing it, is coming to us. It's the simplification of the tools that they're using these days means that, you know, you can put an Alteryx in the hands of a business user and he can now do regression testing, all those nice basic machine learning techniques without really knowing any of the details behind it.
Sorry, Graham, can I just?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say it's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure we could go on. And Graham, I massively love to go against what you just said, but I'm running out of time. So I do love the topic, and it's great to hear what people's contributing in there. I'll pass on to Jan because we're going to move into the kind of core courses and those type of things. But look, thanks, Graham, for talking today. Stuart from Exasol will be around and working. Stuart Powell from Exasol will be around and working at the Doug events. So hopefully we'll hear more from Exasol in the future. And I'm sure there's lots of topics we could delve into. So I'll pass over to Jan, go into core courses.
Thanks, Gary. I'd like to introduce Martin Squires, Stuart Robbins, and Martin Callingham, who came in earlier. We've been having lots of meetings over the last X number of months trying to figure out how to run our core courses during a pandemic online, and those discussions have evolved into several ideas. And it also occurred to me that some of you have never met all of our trainers, regardless of whether you sent your analysts on their training courses. You've never met them, you might not know what the other courses are about. So by way of an introduction, I've asked the trainers to come here, give an outline of each of their courses, and then Martin Squires is going to explain how he came up with this super idea. So I think I'm going to start with Stuart, and over to you.
Perfect. Can you all hear me? Somebody wave. Perfect. Thank you. Well, you all waved, so excellent. It's always nice to be welcome. So, as Jan said, I'm Stuart Robbins. I work for Teradata, so I have a particular point of view as well there, Graham, on what you were saying. Before that, I was at HP. I've been in consulting for about a decade. Before that, I had a real job for 25 years. And I worked at E.ON and Barclays, and I ran analytic teams there. And I cut my teeth as an analyst when I had hair, and that was a long time ago. And I started off at Nationwide, so mostly banking. I think we've got about 3 minutes to talk about the courses. I haven't worked out whether what I'm going to say takes 3 minutes. The joy of going first means that Martin might get 30 seconds at the end. We've got 3 courses, and they fit together kind of through the life cycle of an analyst's career. And I'd like to say that was deliberate right back in the very beginning, but we've been running these courses for some years. They fit together quite neatly. And the original intent was courses that you cannot buy as out in the open market. So we're not doing things like presentation skills. We're not teaching people how to write fantastic Python scripts or SAS or whatever. You really kind of, the idea was that we exposed some of the wounds over time that we'd gathered as a community of increasingly old boys. Sorry, Martin and Martin. So I'll start with Being a Better Analyst, which is my course. And they all run for a day. Historically, we've run them face to face, of course, because that's what the world used to be. And I suppose I wrote mine from the principle that we all know what a good analyst looks like when we see it, but how do you get to be a good analyst? And so what I tried to do was write what I think of as a series of hints and tips about being the sorts of behaviours that an analyst needs to exhibit, the sorts of ways of approaching problems that perhaps I would expect from a good analyst. And I suppose I start from a principle that analysts are born, not made. So what I'm looking for is to exaggerate some traits of the analyst and tamp down on some of the others, make people more self-aware that being an analyst is mostly great, but there are 1 or 2 little behaviours that you need to keep your eyes on. And encouraging people to recognise that their job is about, that you hear the old hackneyed phrase of being in the knowledge economy. Well, that's obviously what we do. And that means they have to think. And they have to think more than the people in marketing or the people in the supply chain or the people in, call centres, whatever it happens to be. So if you're going to be the brains of the operation, you have to understand how to work. Broadly, the course breaks down into half a dozen areas. There's some general, what I think of as general life skills for being an analyst. Things like situational awareness, I always used to say read the newspaper, but they don't, because nobody reads newspapers anymore. But being aware of the general environment, that sort of thing. And then the analytic process, I sort of step through it in varying levels of detail. There's framing the brief, which is really important, because if you don't know what the problem is that you're trying to solve, you're not going to do good analysis. We talk a little bit about data, but very small amounts, because of course we're dealing with all of the different member companies and everybody has different data. We talk quite a lot about analysis, and that's more about the principles of analysis, things like assumptions, what insight really is versus doing a bit of analysis. All of this is targeted at newer analysts typically, although we have had people with 10 or 15 years experience, because there's always something new to learn. Then we finish off with presenting, not presentation skills, because I'm not a master at that myself, but the sorts of things that you need to think about, like, and I see Paul Longley's joined, things like maps, very important. Bright colours on maps, always good for selling to executives. And and the importance of implementation, because all of the above is wasted if you don't focus enough on implementing. And so we talk a little bit about that too. We have lots of case study work, a couple of case study sessions. I would say we have managed participation. This is one of those things about having a certain personality type. I'm aware of the personality type. I am that personality type. So people are, I think, more than encouraged to participate, but not quite forced to. There's group work in the case studies, because I'm trying to get people to think of different ways of working, again, because if you're an analyst, you very often work on your own, and particularly nowadays you do. So it's about working as teams. What else would I say? Yeah, so we do face-to-face. Because I'm an old boy and I'm old-fashioned that way, I much prefer face-to-face courses. I think it's much better. But we have actually tested it online, and leaving aside technical problems, it did work. It was strangely less satisfying from a personal perspective, but we can deliver those online too. So I don't know if I've taken 3 minutes, but I'm going to stop there. I can't read it, Martin.
We'll go to Martin Callingham, and then Martin Squires can carry through. Martin.
My old eyes, Martin, I can't read it. Over to you, Mr. Callingham.
You're muted, aren't you? Or are you not speaking?
He's muted, talking to himself.
Martin, you're talking to yourself.
Hazard of the old.
Hello, shall I tell a dirty joke? No, small. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, right, okay. Yeah, I started the first course, and I was actually pretty worried about it when I did the first course for Doug, because in a sense, I was surrounded by experts, and I was just nervous about going about teaching this particular topic. Now, the topic that has emerged from my course is really the psychology of handling the results of an analysis, the heart of that. Most jobs go through perfectly well, do the job, it's clear what the job is, it's clear what the results are, and there's no problem. And sometimes it's the absolute opposite. And that's the issue that I try and address. So, I mean, analysis is a rational process, and it is supposed to help people in the company make the decisions related to their job, but it's not always rational. The job, I get people to talk about their jobs, and the job of an analyst is very, very satisfying and fun and enjoyable to do. And people like very much the positive side of the job. We have access to all sorts of people around the company. We can do what we like, basically. Get lots of toys to play with and data to mess about with, and it's all just a lot of fun. But actually, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the opposite to that. And the issue, therefore, of the course comes down to dealing with the notion of when rationality doesn't work, when the problem is not explained properly, or in our views, not explained properly. There are huge differences in expectation. Now, if you take the notion of rationally supporting an argument, we've had two brilliant examples locally, one of which is Brexit, where you have two sides, each arguing rational things and still throwing bricks at each other, because they can't understand the rationality of the other side. And that is the sort of situation that I'm sure you're all familiar with coming in, that happens with certain jobs in the company. So the way that we go about it is I get the group to decide what's good about their job, and they love their job, and they say lots of lovely things. And then I say, so what's bad about it? And then it all starts, and you get many, many more things. And basically, is no one understands me sometimes. So I then say, your job is very important. That the response is that on some occasions I'm taking no notice of. I said, this is where you earn your money. You earn your money when your client or the client group is not accepting what you are saying. It may be that you're wrong, of course, but actually it could be that they're wrong. So you need to do things about this. And how are you going to do it? How are you going to cope with what we would call the difficult client? Of course, they're not a difficult client. They're a person coming from a different perspective. And I then take them through the fact that their job, I argue, that the job of a person doing our sort of work is the most important job in the company. It's not an add-on, it's not on the side, it's actually fundamental to the success of the company. And actually, many companies have collapsed because of their inability to cope with the issues of the changing world and the resistance of the senior people in this to recognise that. For example, who could imagine that Kodak wouldn't exist today? Huge company just vanished. And you go through Wikipedia, you find dozens and dozens and dozens of massive companies have collapsed over a stupid inability to recognise the reality of the world. And I say this is when your job matters. So you have to fight to overcome the problems of failure to recognise what you're saying. And that doesn't mean being rude and horrible. It means being clever and getting your way around the difficulties for people who have coming to terms with what you're saying. So that's really the heart of what I'm trying to get over. You must do. It is. If you say the client is not accepting my decisions, and you believe got findings, and you find they aren't right, you should fight like mad to get those decisions accepted, not just give up and say, oh, well, they haven't accepted them. Now, we have an exercise which we run in the afternoon, and that is based on a case study. And in that case study, there are lots of issues raised, and we have 3 personalities. And we give information about those 3 personalities. And then we take the problem, we don't handle a problem, I take the problem, then list 6 or 7 solutions to that problem. And with the information, and then we break the course into 3 groups or 4 groups, and then each group addresses that problem and then has to decide what they think on the basis of the information they have is the best solution of the given list to it. And do you know, they pick different solutions. And this is a fundamentally important issue because the people on the course are good, high quality, often very experienced analysts. How can they, with the same information, pick different solutions? So that's the first lesson. There is no one solution. There are alternative solutions. There are different ways of skinning the cat. So that's a very important lesson. The next thing we do is we introduce characters that work in the company with their different weird characteristics, like we all know, like ourselves, for example. And can you still hear me? Can you still hear? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great, thank you. And then we ask them to work out what each of those characters really want out of the options that they've been working on. And so they have to discuss the psychology of their clients. They have to cross the bridge from the data to the people sitting, listening to what they're saying and trying to understand their standpoint. And then once they've done that, we say, so which solution that we've got, of the 7 or whatever it is, would each of these clients want? And then in each group, and which would they not want? And then in each group, we make them take the client and the problem they don't want and create a rational argument, or an argument, I shouldn't say rational, argument to overcome that person's objections to that, to accepting the one they don't want. So that's essentially the heart of the whole course. And it's very, very interesting when you get a group of high quality analysts coming up with just different solutions to the problem, different solutions for overcoming the objections that a client might have when they have an emotional attachment to what that solution is. So that's it in a nutshell. It's fun to do, and they like doing it. They do enjoy this.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Martin.
Okay, hiya. Right, so I guess mine was the third course to come into being, and was the result of me having too much wine with Keith Dugmore at one of the annual Christmas bashes, and opened my trap and got persuaded to do this. We were looking at what courses only Doug could do this and what could be built, and I think I've made the comment to Keith that we had what I think in Stuart's course is a really good course on how to be a bloody good analyst. And I think what Martin's course does is the people I sent on Martin's course were people I wanted to be a really good senior analyst, because I think that skill set that Martin's course builds is what makes a difference between a senior analyst and an analyst. And what I mentioned to Keith was I probably was one of the people that Stuart talks about that skill set of analyst born. I kind of possessed too many Wisdom Cricket almanacs and Parnell's football almanacs as a kid, and I kind of had the skill set to build on. And I'm unusual and blessed on Myers-Briggs with being an ENTP, which kind of gets you to be a senior analyst, because when actually everybody goes, who's interested, everybody else goes, I'm not sure, and I just go, me. So kind of, I got to be senior analyst just by being a gobby bastard. What I did nearly cause myself a nervous breakdown, though, was going from senior analyst to managing for the first time and leading, which I think is a massive change and really difficult. And that's where I taught myself into a course. So the course is aimed at people who are either senior analysts who people are talking about promoting for the first time, or people who are kind of year one, kind of in the job and thinking, what the hell did I let myself in for? And there's been a few people a bit more experienced gone on it as well, but its sweet spot is people in kind of 18 months either side of a promotion into leadership role for the first time. It hangs off I think that leadership decision of who do you promote still comes down to what I'd call the kind of Mike Brealey, Ian Botham problem. So for anybody old enough to remember the Ashes series and Botham captain in England, because he was the probably the world's best all-rounder at the time, but an appalling captain, and Brealey, who was at best a pretty average test batsman, and that's being generous, gets fetched in because, as Rod Hogg, the Australian, said, the man had a degree in people. And England win. You can look at the same thing on football. You look at the guys who've won the most Premiership titles as managers. Ferguson was a fairly crap centre forward with Aberdeen. Klopp and Wenger were both second division equivalent players in their countries, and Mourinho was too fat and slow to play professional football. I can sympathise. Rugby, if that's your bag, Joe Schmidt, the Irish coach, very, very successful. He was a school teacher, which I think oddly says a lot about the skill set. I think where it gets people in trouble is HR are not very good at working out actually what leadership training analytical leaders or knowledge leaders need. They always assume that people want the sort of pseudo-military traditional model and everybody wants to be the chief exec, and it doesn't really work. And what happens without that as well is you got promoted because you were the best analyst. You're now asked to lead a team. You try to do both jobs and be the best analyst and lead the team, and it just does not work. So the course itself, that's probably the first half an hour of it in a nutshell anyway. But the course goes through, I use a thing called Career Anchors, which we get all the people on the course to do this. It's a questionnaire. It's not quite Myers-Briggs type stuff, but what it does is it tells you what the main drivers you want to have satisfaction in your career are. One of them is managerial, which is the I want to be the CEO one, but the others include things like autonomy, technical, service dedication, or lifestyle. oddly, what's happened for a group of people who are managers or wanting to be managers, in 10 years, only 10% of people have ever actually identified managerial as their key driver, which kind of puts a bit of bones behind the Martin didn't just invent the bullshit about Ian Botham. I've now got stats. When we started doing it, the big drivers were autonomy and technical, generally, or service dedication. So people either wanted to serve others and provide the assist for the marketeers or the commercial guys and wanted to be the backup for them. They wanted to be their sort of the hand of the king, not the king. Very much that sort of skill set was in there. For me, when I did it, it was autonomy and technical, which meant I'd caused myself a massive problem still wanting to be the best analyst long after I should have left the coding tools alone. And the first leadership job I ever applied for was because I figured out actually there was less people to tell me what to do if I got promoted. And the other guy who was going for the job was a grade A prick, and I wasn't going to listen to him telling me what to do. So I had to kind of go for it. But not because I wanted to run anything. It was just I didn't want to report into the other bloody option. So we go through that, and I think it helps with both actually people realizing what actually they get value from, but also people have done it with their teams subsequently, which again gets the fact that actually people don't trust, analysts don't tend to trust people who want to be CEOs either. So I think once you kind of realize that some leadership training gives you habits, your team just go, oh shit, he's been on a course. So it's trying to provide the antidote to some of that. So what the rest of the course then does, I go through a leadership model which compares traditional leadership models to a knowledge worker leadership model. The nutshell version, trying to stick to the timing, is traditional leadership model, very militarily type based. You can tell people what to do, basically. I've never actually had many analysts I can get away with telling them what to do. I've usually got to at least partly influence and persuade. But it's far more that people are too highly skilled and too intelligent to actually just be told what to do. I'd be a bit worried I'd employed one of them if I could get away with it. So there's a separate model on knowledge leadership. And then the last part of the course is 10 things I wish I'd known before somebody let me be in charge of anything, which is basically great balls up Martin made in that predominantly in the first couple of years, but there's a few that are a bit more recent. But it talks to things like, if you're recruiting, I know I went through the stage of I got promoted the first time, got a bit of a pay rise, and the person I had to get to replace me was paid damn near the same as what I was on. And I kind of kicked back against trying to find that for ages. And the thing I learned was grow up. That guy's going to get me a really good bonus. I'm just going to suck that up and hire them. So there's tips like that. There's tips like never recruit anybody you think might just be good enough because you're under pressure. Because actually, it's really easy to manage out somebody who is a total wombat. That everybody's patience runs out, and the dickheads you manage out. But it's the ones that try really hard and are just good enough, and then you're stuck with somebody that looks like Brighton every year and finishes fourth bottom. And it's like, oh God, and it drives you mental. So it's like, hang on for the better. Always explain why you've got an empty chair rather than put somebody in it who's never going to be good enough. So that's the sort of. So it's a bit of a mix of theory, practice, and. Hopefully tries to help people through that transition.
Thank you, Martin. Before you go on to your idea, I just want to explain to everyone that you've just had a tiny glimpse without any of the usual anecdotes of these 3 courses, which without the anecdotes, you're missing out on pure gold, which is why when we had our discussions, Martin came up with this idea of a panel. Martin.
Yeah, so we were trying to figure out what would work while we still would be struggling to get everybody in a space, and why traditional courses are still going to face-to-face struggle a bit for a little while yet. And that could be because some companies are still not sending people on courses, even though from next Monday they might be able to. We've still got a lot of venues that are insisting on face masks. There's all sorts of stuff that would get in the way. And one of the things we did at Boots as part of being in Doug years ago, we had it was actually Martin Callingham, it was Keith Dugmore and the late Andrew Tasker. We kind of had them in, and we ran a workshop, and it was really good. But one of the team fed back at the end of it. It was a bit like, it felt a bit shamanistic, which was a bit strange. But he said it felt like you were just being allowed in this big teepee to talk to the 3 wise men, and that anybody who couldn't get value out of that for a bit was a bit of a burk for not asking the right questions. And I thought, well, actually, there's something in that. So we know we've had probably 200 or 300 people must have been through the courses now in one description or another. And we've never done an awful lot to kind of feed back to them or have them ask questions. That stuff that says, guys, I've been trying to do this. I really wish I'd have asked you this that day or whatever. Because what we thought was to get the three of us together and run a workshop predominantly aimed at some of the people who've been on the courses and had questions about either almost a sort of Q&A, can we help you kind of seminar for people to just bring their problems and things they were struggling with, and as to try to use the lessons that we'd done on the courses, or just generally actually in the only Doug can do this. I dread to think what the combined experience of Martin Stewart and me adds up to, but it's a number that's fairly depressing. But it's like there's not many training companies would stick you kind of into a room with people with, it must be over 100 years experience between us, and said, feel free to ask what you want about how to be a better analyst, senior analyst or team leader. So that was the idea, that we did something which would be relatively open and free form, doesn't require us to produce an awful lot of materials that might or might not work online, but would add value to basically what people would get out of it would be very dependent on what they bring. If people bring good questions, they'll get value.
And that actually sums up what I was going to bring, a point I was going to make later, is that each of the courses, and I've attended most of them, well, I've attended all of them since I've been with Doug, they are made up of they are what the people are who are there. Every course has been different because each group of people are different. So you lose that when you're online, or if you have bespoke courses. So very, I'm going to cut this really short. I'm sorry, guys, but we're sort of overrunning. Are there any particular questions from anyone before I sort of wrap up?
No, I think it sounds fantastic, if I'm honest with you. I think my only question would be, would you want attendees to be sort of submitting their questions in advance, just to give you an opportunity to be frank, filter on quality and make sure they're not the same sort of question, just answered 7 or 8 different ways, really?
It would be nice if they could, because it would give us a solid grounding, but then we could, I think, I don't know what Martin and Stuart would say, but I'd be happy to kind of go free form from that, depending on where the discussion takes us. But it'd be good to have that kind of grounding to get things kicked off.
Yeah, I think it also avoids the embarrassing silence right at the beginning where nobody wants to be one to speak. So, yeah, 3 or 4 questions to get us going.
So what the general plan is, originally we were going to do this as part of the core courses, but as we move into face-to-face, I'm looking at having some face-to-face courses this year before we go into the inevitable lockdown again, because that's what I'm expecting, which will be in Peterborough. That's something I've got to discuss with the trainers separately to make those dates available. I want all of the Doug organisations to understand that we need at least 8 to 12 people to make those courses face-to-face work. Any less than that? Sorry, Martin.
I think that's the key thing for me. If I'm looking at mine, it's kind of the worst thing is we get 8 and then we find a few people have to drop out where it ends up with 4 because it'll be a bit crap. If we're kind of thinking, actually, my company is still going to struggle to sign off external training, half my team are really keen to do face-to-face, but there's another half will absolutely sit in a corner with a mask on and not want to talk to people. If we do that, would it be better to do them online? Because I think I'm quite up for either, but I just want it to be good. So I'd like a steer on, do we go back to physical and do we think that demand's there, or actually would the next 6-8 months still be better with us planning to do online?
So rather than discuss that here, which will probably take up the rest of the meeting, I'll be in touch with all of the Doug members to get some sort of feeling about that. The panel session that Martin was talking about, I'm going to suggest we actually hold it at our conference, which will be online in October, which is a way of introducing the panel. If we can't do face-to-face at all before then we'll look at doing other things and doing a mix and match of all of this experience and trying to get it out there in the best way we possibly can until we're free to do what we used to do. So those discussions will go on. Please email me with any ideas, suggestions on how you think it could work, and we'll sort of build that in. But at the moment, it's purely down to the trainers' availability, whether we can go face to face and all that sort of stuff. So I would like to thank all three of you. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. I'd also like to apologise to Paul Longley because I've kept you waiting. I've done a Tim. I'm sorry. Right.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. So I'd like to introduce Paul Longley from CDRC, who is going to talk to us about the paper. I tabled the papers in the email, so you should have already seen them. So, Paul, you're on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jan, and I'm conscious of your time, so I'll really just breeze through the document that was pre-circulated. I deal with the papers. So, for those of you that don't know me, I've had quite a long association with Doug over the years. I know quite a few of you, and in 2014. A big research council initiative was established called the Consumer Data Research Centre, where basically we try and get hold of data from business, public sector and administrative sources, mix them together and make things happen with them, really. So it's a centre for sort of researching the provenance, the application, and the use of consumer data sources, along with other things. So the document really just sort of sets out just some of our recent, fairly recent activities, and the main one, I think, really. Perhaps for a little bit of discussion is the Master's Dissertation Scheme. So Keith Dugmore and I actually established this prior to the establishment of CDRC, and I think it's now it's currently in its 9th year. And as I say in the document, this year has actually been a record, really, notwithstanding all the issues of pandemics and so forth. We've actually got 22 dissertations being done with external organisations, that's businesses and companies, which were awarded competitively to 67 student applications. So the issue here is what happens, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a company agrees to pay a notional honorarium of £500 to a student for successful completion of a master's dissertation as part of their projects, which typically deal with horizon scanning issues that an organisation wants to find out about, but probably wouldn't allocate staff time explicitly to deal with. And over the years, it's proved to be a very successful initiative, with many of the students, and this is a point I'll come back to, being subsequently offered jobs with the organisation with which they undertake a master's dissertation. Because in a way, going back to what Martin was just saying about, sort of learn, how you learn and how somebody, how somebody fits into a job and so forth. This is an opportunity, in a way, to test drive a motivated and interested student for 3 or 4 months and see whether they're employable. And so the scheme, as I say, it's a nationwide one. It's interdisciplinary. It's not just geography. It's computer science. It's economics. It's psychology, etc., etc. And students come from all parts of the UK, and there's a list in the paper that was circulated. And so far, so standard a report. But what we actually did this year is we sort of thought, well, we've been running this scheme now for 9 years. What we'll do is we'll establish an alumni network. And so the idea here was really, first of all, from the point of view of our own interest and curiosity, to see where students who had worked on this scheme have ended up, and we knew some of them had ended up on working for their original dissertation sponsor, but others, sort of move organisations and so on and so forth. And so we held an inaugural. Basically, we've developed a LinkedIn list of contacts of names of students and organisations that they work for. And what we did a couple of months back, Jonathan Reynolds at the Saïd Business School, who's one of the co-investigators on CDRC, hosted an online event. We got one of the usual suspects. Martin Squires is a visiting professor at UCL, so we lent on him to give a talk, and we had a series of really where are they now presentations, along with presentations by the best dissertations from last year's students. And I don't know what Martin thought in retrospect, but I think in general terms, the feedback that we got was very good, and it's something that we want to do sort of going forward. And so a question for Jan and for Doug, I suppose, really, sort of time moves on and so forth. And I'm aware you've got your the Doug conference is online this October. We do need to take a decision pretty soon whether we're going to keep the master's dissertation scheme in harness with the Doug annual conference. And one thing we could actually perhaps sort of consider talking about, we've got an alumni list, as I say, of sort of bright young things who've done relevant dissertations, which is a nice way of sort of infusing perhaps a bit of young blood into the Doug annual conference itself, and also infuse some blood in terms of Doug recruitment, in terms of sort of these organisations and so forth. And so those are conversations that I think we need to come up with pretty soon, because the Oxford event worked extremely well. It was run extremely professionally. We got technicians and so forth in to do it. What we, I hear what people have been murmuring about future lockdowns and things like that. If we load up, a series of students to give presentations and get people plumbed into attending, we have got to be, excuse me, pretty sure that stuff sort of actually happens as advertised, and that's a problem that I know we're all juggling with. So those are the first two items on my report. The third one is something that we did, which is fairly self-explanatory. We did a sort of a project funded by the Research Council called Local Data Spaces, where 4 CDRC data scientists were basically seconded to support local authority COVID-19 responses. And so here, local authority research bases have been hollowed out very much over the last decade with successive local authority cuts. And we did a series of projects of extending research capacity to local authority COVID responses. And I stuck in the report a couple of illustrative examples of this. We've now got, coming out of this, a dashboard which allows local authorities to look at how their footfall decreased relative to overall decreases across all local authorities in the UK, for example. And so there's a few nice products in that. The other items relate to some of our another scheme that we got involved in with Research Council support, which is called our ABC scheme, Accelerating Business Collaboration. And what here, working with Matthew Hopkinson, ex of Local Data Company and now Didobi, we developed a student ambassador scheme where PhD students who were doing research which was relevant to the business community were actually seconded to business organisations for a period of 6 weeks to do relevant projects that were relevant that demonstrated the impact of the PhDs, but also did stuff that were relevant to the supervising organisations. And there's a couple of examples pasted into the report about COVID resilience of commuter towns, how some commuter towns have fared much better in sort of post-COVID compared to others. There's another one talking about an audit for, I think, Geolytics about different in-app data providers and so forth, and the robustness and resilience of the data sources. We're also doing other stuff, sort of horizon scanning stuff on. We're currently digitizing a whole load of old telephone directories, which is perhaps marginal relevance to Doug members, but it's relevant to like looking at social and geographic mobility. And we're creating a range of data packs. We've now got new data packs that say in every year, when people move from local authority district to local authority district, do they move up market, down market, or hanging around market? We've got indicators of annual churn and population turnover. We've now got data packs of distances of residential moves when people move at sub-local authority scale. In actual fact, I think it's MSOA, or it may even be LSOA. The report finishes up with a list of publications. A Martin Callingham point, sort of there's often been, we can't look at these. Well, now, oh yes, you can, because I think most or all of these are open access. And so if you're interested and Google, certainly most of them on the list, you can get a peek at them. So that's it. That's me. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Paul. I will liaise with you about dissertation and the Doug conference. I see no reason why we can't include that with the conference. I'll have a word with Tim and we'll sort out the agenda. And we'll do the similar to what we did last time online. It all worked. It ran smoothly. And we do have the Royal Society booked for next year, face-to-face, obviously. So hopefully we'll get that. And just to illustrate your point, Guy, who is representing Barclays, I met for the first time doing his dissertation at the Doug conference lots of years ago. And here he is representing an organisation, Doug. So
rising through the ranks.
Yeah, that's right. It's also worth shouting out a couple of other people who are in my first year of the programme have now kind of branched out as well. If we're talking about spreading the network. So Helen Parker, for example, she's now a manager at Gusto. Thomas Murphy, he's now pretty senior at the Crown Estate. And Matthew Pratt must be doing something right because he's just got a nice flash car and he's currently working at Javelin. So it's definitely worth keeping these people on our books.
excellent. No better advert than that, really, is there? Good soundbite, actually. Well done. That's great. Okay, thanks, Paul. Are there any sort of pressing questions? Because I know we're running late. Are we all happy?
I'm happy. I'd just like to say that was great, Paul. I thought it was great to listen and definitely want to catch up more on it.
Okay, very good. Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Yeah.
Okay. My apologies to Juan at Map Action. Paul, Juan, welcome. Are you here? Where are you?
I am. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Right. Yes.
Okay,
yes,
good. I have a presentation. So before I actually start talking, let me just make sure that I can get this presentation going. Just a minute. And can you confirm that you can see that? I'm sorry.
We also have sound.
Okay, good. Right. So let me see. So if you can see the presentation, my name is Juan Duarte. I'm the technical director for Map Action. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really interesting to hear the areas of work and the updates that you have been providing, and the fascinating presentations. I am very interested in the tech side of things. So even though I am speaking for MapAction, I am not a GIS person. So let me say that first. I don't do geospatial, I do technology, which actually means that I do very little of the data science. What I want to do is to enable it and to make sure that MapAction is able to make use of not only data science, but data in general. And that's my mission at MapAction. So the presentation that I'll do was originally done with my colleague Hannah Kerr, which is she's our data scientist. And I wish she could have joined me for this one, but I thought that I would use this presentation because not only does it provide a quick introduction, a rather thorough introduction to MapAction and what we have been doing and what we're intending to do in the future, but it also allows me to give you a clear focus on data, which I thought was relevant for the group. So what will I cover? I want you to know a bit more about MapAction and its role in the sector. I would like to tell you a bit about what we're doing with regards to data science, but mainly I would like to show you why we think this is relevant and how through technology and through the use of data, we believe that we can improve our impact in the sector. And I also want to share some key challenges with you that we have, because perhaps you can help and would love it if you could help us. So having said that, quick introduction to MapAction. MapAction was started in 2002. MapAction is mainly about people. We are a volunteer membership organization made up of over 86 volunteers at the moment, and we're always recruiting. We aim to maintain a team that is available not only to deploy to emergencies rather quickly, we are first responders, but we're also skilled in a number of areas that allows us to work proactively and allow us to work without being in the context of an emergency. So you can see in that slide the team, that's actually quite an old one, and it doesn't have our latest batches of volunteers. We are currently running a volunteer recruitment process, which is culminating around October, when we will appoint a new cadre of about 6 volunteers. And I'm glad to say that 2 of the roles, we're advertising for 3 roles. 2 of them are tech related. One of them is software development, and the other one is a data engineer role. So not GIS, but actually supporting this new way of working at MapAction that is heavily reliant on data. We are predominantly based in the UK, but especially over the last couple of years, we spread around the world. Now we have staff in Canada and New Zealand and Europe, and there are volunteers scattered throughout Europe and in some other places around the world. And so we are a global team. We're increasingly becoming a global team, and that works globally. Although most of our training, capability building, and the staff are mostly do reside in the UK. We have done a number of missions that is actually out of date. It is always out of date, no matter what we do with this slide. We work on these missions in different contexts. Sometimes it's a natural hazard. Sometimes it's a complex emergency that it can be a protracted emergency. It can be a very slow onset emergency. But no matter which type of emergency, we're always intending to respond to the needs of those that are affected by these emergencies. We do so working through our volunteers, but also in collaboration with others. So you can see here one of our MapAction volunteers working with the UN. We have a long-standing relationship with UNDEC, who respond to emergencies within the UN. And we have a number of memorandums of understanding, partnerships with regional organizations around the world, namely CIDIMA in the Caribbean, which covers most of the Caribbean, AHA in the Pacific and Asia, CSDRR also in Asia. And we're intending to increase the number of partnerships so that we can work proactively with these organizations. And when it comes to working reactively, responding to an emergency, we have agreements and we have working relationships that allow us to respond quicker and more effectively. Unsurprisingly, as the name says, we do maps. We actually do a lot of maps, and it's It's a blessing, of course, because people do know us for our maps, but we don't not only do maps. Most of the work that we do actually does not involve a map. And it won't surprise you that a lot of the work to create a map is data work. So we spend about 80% of our time, if not more, sometimes it's 95% of our time, on doing data preparation so that you can put those insights on the map. But there's a lot of data work, and our volunteers and our staff are very familiar with the challenges and the requirements of data work to enable mapping. We do quite a few different types of maps depending on the circumstances and the partner that we're working with. There's always a set of maps that we're calling here core maps that we make. Those vary from about 7 to 9, depending on how you count them and depending on whether you're counting situational maps. But there's at least 7 that we can do regardless of any situation, and that, quite importantly for me, we can do in preparedness. So we don't have to wait for an emergency to have those maps, and more importantly, to have the data ready to create maps for a given location or a given region. And this leads me to the main point that I'm after over the last perhaps year and a half, if not 2 years at MapAction, which is this transformation of going from a reactive organization to a very proactive organization, based mostly around our attitude, our workflows with regards to data. So we are looking very, very intently at this first statement. How do we focus more on data rather than mapping? Because everyone acknowledges that there's a lot of data work, that 80% of their time might be working on the data, but we still think as if we're just making maps. And there's a shift to be made in not only the mentality, not only in the workflows individually for every mapper, but also in the capability of the organization. So we used to only recruit GIS experts, and we were full of GIS experts. And then you realize, actually, a lot of the work that we're doing doesn't even require GIS. It may need more insights from the data side and from the technology side, making sure that we have the right infrastructure. So in making this shift, a key acknowledgement, and my approach in describing this to you is rather different than when we have done this presentation before, but you, I think, understand better than any other group how data actually needs to be catered for. All the preparation that needs to be made in terms of the technology, the foundation in terms of technology, of the capability, the training, and some roles, increasingly at MapAction, are going to be not GIS roles. They're going to be enabling GIS, and they're going to be focused on data. One such role is the role of the data scientist. It's a year and a half since we hired our first staff data scientist. And we started data science not from the data science perspective, but from the requirements of data science, informing how we needed to approach things differently. So how we, in terms of our technology stack and the roles and our workflows and the kinds of products that we could create, so how that would inform what we need to do in the future. After a year and a half, this role is now becoming fully operational. And when we make that distinction, there are roles like mine that are not operational. We're enabling roles. We support our operations department. Operations are who run our projects, and they do the missions, and they fly away, and they go to the Caribbean. Unfortunately, when there's a hurricane, they can't go to the beach. And we're also thinking about automation a lot. So how can we make sure that, because we have 80% of the work all the time in front of us, how can we automate everything that can be automated so that we can focus on the key aspects that we really need to engage with? So if it's automated and the computer can do it, let the computer do it. So that's a mantra that we're trying to get people to think about all the time. Our volunteers are very, very dedicated, and when they see a task, they'll just engage with the task. The way I'm trying to get them to see the problem is that they shouldn't really, that we should have a way of offloading that to some ETL process, and then they can engage with thinking about the map. So in that regard, I like the way many of you were presenting about the role of the analyst. Our GIS volunteers are actually analysts. They understand the problem. They understand the requirements. They understand the impact that they can have. And sometimes they need to convince somebody that if only they considered this, we can have more a better impact. We can get something done quicker, and therefore in an emergency, this matters a lot. So what is data science in particular? And I warn you, the next set of slides are the ones that Hannah would have done. So she would have done a much better job. But let me tell you a little bit. So what does putting data before the map mean to us? It means that MapAction really has to shift its thinking. We still do maps. We still are all about the insights that we put in the map, but we need to make that shift. Because even though a map might be very simple, like this one, note this is an automatically produced map already, based on our recent automation efforts. It is based on a highly curated set of data sets, and it uses one of our simplified templates. So this is something important that a lot of people don't notice. We actually take away most stuff from regular mapping. So we focus people on what really matters. And most of our maps actually look a lot simpler, and maybe they don't look very sophisticated, but there's a lot of thinking behind that. Some of our maps, one of our volunteers refers to them as naked maps. They're just black and white lines, and they're designed so that people can draw on them. And simplifying them is actually the trick. So what you see here is actually, as you could guess, based on a lot of data. There are 22 data sets that go into a country overview map, which is that one. And those 22 data sets require ETL. They require finding the data somewhere, finding the reliable source of data that needs to be transformed in a particular way and loaded onto our standard directory structure, because we enable remote offline mapping as well. So we can't have services that are online, and our volunteers rely on a structure that uses a naming convention and allows them to run a mission, potentially entirely offline for the duration of the mission, just on the basis of a directory structure with the right source of data. So what happens then is we use that data to layer constantly on these foundational core maps. We're always layering everything else that we come to understand about the situation. So the base map, those core maps are current focus. We know that those core maps are going to be used because they represent this base layer on which we build everything else. So if we already have a fully curated map of a given location, then we engage with just the situational. We don't worry about getting that map perfect. It is already taken care of, and we can engage with who is there, what are they doing. We can essentially do what we call 3-4W mapping: who, what, where, what are they trying to achieve, how can we engage with them to better support their work. We use a number of data sets. In particular, I'd like to highlight OSM, the OpenStreetMap database, which is to us like the Wikipedia of maps. And we use quite a few of its aspects. So things like roads, rivers, lakes, buildings, hospitals, settlements. It is one source for that. It is not our only source for that. A lot of the time, even though OSM is updated and hot, our colleagues in the sector do a great job in ramping up and getting things updated as an emergency happens, we still rely on other sources of information. Some areas of the world, surprisingly, remain unmapped, and we have had to run missions in them. We use a lot of satellite data, and we do engage in remote sensing analysis. We use population data. Most of the time, we're interested in how an emergency is impacting the population in the location. And so population density, for example, exemplified here in this data set, which is from WorldPop, it helps us make sense of who is affected. What's the combination of the extent of the event and the extent of population? Where are those overlaps? Or in preparedness, we can figure out things like vulnerability, potential vulnerability given expected expected types of emergencies. So the other important point here is, and this is looking at things from rather the data scientist perspective, which is Hannah's perspective here, it's trends over time. A lot of the time, a map is just a snapshot in time. But increasingly, things that are not maps require trend analysis, for example, or time series analysis, so that you can figure out something like this. And what you're looking at is actually the price of corn in Malawi over the last 20 years. Sometimes analysis like that, or recent other examples like being able to predict locust swarms in Eastern Africa, which we engaged in very recently over the last 6 months, actually, and there were 2 of those. So that requires analyzing data over time, and sometimes this is quite a bit of data, actually. So humanitarian data in general, it looks very similar to the data that you work with. We don't work with big data, not yet, at least. Sorry. And it looks like, as I say, your data. It is mostly spatial in nature because that's our expertise. It does have temporal dimensions. We're interested in what was there, what there is now, and perhaps when working in preparedness, what could happen if we're aiming to do simulations. It comes from many sources. We deal with things like OSM, but also the Humanitarian Data Exchange, with local authorities. We do remote sensing. We have many agreements with companies that provide us with data on an ad hoc basis, but also on a regular basis, and we need to work with data constantly. It may be, as Hannah tends to point out, it may be too large to think of in the traditional map action way of a single lone mapper working with a directory. And this is perhaps one of the growth areas for us. And rather importantly, it is of variable quality. And sometimes that means, very poor quality. And a lot of the time that means that the quality aspect is that it's just unavailable. And this is actually my bit, the foundation for things. So this is what, as the technical director, I'm trying to achieve at MapAction. And let me start with the end in mind. This is our model, the way that we're representing things so that we can explain it to most people. So this is in no way a technically accurate representation, but it does combine the technical and the intent. We are driven by our impact. So the impact that we aim to have, the people that we want to help, our partners, the beneficiaries, population, the affected population, however you want to call it, that is our motivation. And so we start there. We start with the people. Understanding the requirements, we then develop a product that tends to be a map. Increasingly, it is a combination of a map and something else. So as we dive into analysis, a lot of the time it's better to represent something as other than a map to be better understood. But so we're aiming to use design principles to engage with our partners and the people that we aim to help. And then we backtrack, and we are right there in the first 2 columns here in the data component. And it is significant that there are 2 out of 3 columns related to data, because as we come to understand what our requirement is, one of the things that we want to do is to consistently apply an approach. And once we learn something, we want to replicate that to other locations, especially when we're working in collaboration with regional entities. When we understand something about one country, we want to replicate that and make sure that everyone else in that region benefits. So we are aiming to implement, and this is not something that we have succeeded at yet, but we need to implement a mechanism for data acquisition that is manageable and that is accessible to our volunteers. So this is a collaborative approach to managing perhaps a data lake, perhaps a data warehouse, perhaps now that I know about lake houses, we need to consider that. But this is to enable visualization and analysis. And one of the key things that we do here is we figure out qualitative aspects that need to be improved, because our volunteers actually do a lot of work in identifying these points and helping resolve them, because we are working with those that can resolve them, meaning people in country that are supposed to be collecting these data sets. We can help them figure out how to better do that and how to fill these data gaps. Now, we do that, keep in mind these things that we call our mantras, and I'll focus on just the first two. I've already said we automate the repetitive so that we can focus on the unique, and we focus on the data, not on map creation. So my team, the tech team, is taking this approach in an organization that has traditionally always focused on the map and seen data as secondary. We're flipping that and saying, no, focus on the data. The map we know about, the map we can create, it's about 5% of the effort. If you already have a template, just to feed it with the right data. But getting to the right data is the trick. So that's the approach that we're taking. What it looks so far from a rather high level perspective, as of this year, we are using Airflow, and we have DAGs running to acquire and transform data in a particular way, given a few recipes. And we are using our volunteers who do this process, which they call the data scramble. And it is what it sounds like. They scramble for data last minute to meet the demands of an emergency. We took that concept and we said, all right, let's do data scrambles, but let's not scramble for data. We'll do it slowly. We'll do it in advance. We'll do it in preparation. And then we are currently manually selecting data based on quality markers. We want to change that so that increasingly the data selection process relies on other means of verification that are automated. And we want to do this because we want to find flaws at scale. We want to find data gaps at scale. We want to be able to say, okay, let's analyze a whole continent and find the things that wouldn't meet the demands of our products. And this is a particularly important point. We understand the framing of the data, meaning we understand what we need because we know what it is intended for. Unlike other people that have data, NASA, for example, was doing a presentation in a humanitarian setting, and there was a lady saying, we have lots of data, just use it. It is very nice, but unless you know how you're going to use the data, just availability of data isn't enough. Knowing how we need to use the data, knowing the requirements, knowing the intended use, provides that framing that enables us to say, do we have sufficient data of sufficient quality? Does it really address the need? So right now, we are at a point in which our automation tool, which we call MapChef, is able to produce maps like this one, which is of Malawi again. And we also make other maps based on these very few maps that we're currently able to automate. And we build on those maps made by MapChef, and we're still creating some maps by hand. We need to make sure that we are able to process more data sets so that we enable the creation of more of these maps automatically. What happens so far looks like this. We selected late last year a set of 20 priority countries, and we have 22 data sets for those 22 priority countries. And we were running this process iteratively until all of those issues that are highlighted here in the dashboard that we created to keep track of things, our automation tools were able to determine where we had gaps, where we were failing entirely, where there were some just warnings, issues, and all of those were added to our tasking system. An example of that is here. Our automation tool is able to describe the problem and is able to give our volunteers an indication of what that problem might be and possible solutions. So it's up to the volunteer to grab a task and say, okay, I'll analyze this. And once they figure it out, they submit a fix. And if it passes, then this doesn't happen again. It is resolved. And we get to this point in which we are right now, which is that we currently have 20 countries that were deemed as our priority countries. And this is supposed to be a moving, increasing target. So not only in number of countries, but in number of data sets for each country, so as to enable more mapping of different kinds. Another important aspect that we're working on is data quality, and we're doing that with the Heidelberg Institute for Geoinformation Technology, HIGIT short. They have a tool they call Awesome, and it is awesome. They use the OSM data, therefore the name, and they use the historical OSM database to figure out qualitative aspects of a given area. What we are adding here is, as I was explaining, we look at an area and we say, are we able to make X kind of map for an intended humanitarian purpose? So do we have enough information, for example, on what we consider critical humanitarian infrastructure? And through the Awesome quality analysis tool and the framing of our products, we're able to determine if we have sufficient data of sufficient quality in a given region anywhere in the world. This is in its infancy, but I see a lot of potential here. We have always wanted to explore the issue of data quality as part of our automation and as part of our focus on data. And this is one such avenue. We need to look for more, because OSM is not our only source of data, but it is already allowing us to see things from a data quality perspective. And I'm looking forward to the work after this. In the end, what we're aiming to do is to make our work available to anyone. We have our map and data repository, which you can see here. It is found at maps.mapaction.org. We recently added a different view. Normally we had events, but now what you're looking at is locations. So when in our minds we were only reacting and creating maps for something that happened, it made sense to have an event-based repository. So people that are engaged in that situation at the time could go and get our maps. Increasingly, we want a proactive approach. And therefore, it makes sense to say, okay, let's publish on the basis of either regions or countries. So preemptively, we have already created that view. And the intention is to publish two things, or two types of packages. One is actual maps that anyone can use, and the other is what we're calling sources. And there's another way of looking at this. It might be a package. One of our colleagues came up with the term humanitarian data package, and it's a geo package which contains information in a certain kind, useful for the products that we make. So that is where we want to get to. And based on this foundation that we're building, what we want to provide is actionable insights to everyone engaged in the humanitarian sector in a given location. So to do that, we have been working also with OCHA. My colleague Hannah is actually part-time working seconded to OCHA, and we're working with the predictive analytics team. So this is a team focused on, again, on data and using a lot of data science for their objectives. A couple of examples, perhaps, from the work. This one wasn't done with OCHA, but it was done as part of our new kind of product. It's a very simple one, but don't let the simplicity take away from its impact. It has actually been quite impactful. This was done with an organization called Insecurity Insights, and you can see the URL down there. What it is highlighting is vulnerability for humanitarian actors around the world. And there are reports that they collect and are being mapped and analyzed. And once we engaged with them, we understood that what they needed was actually, rather than just a few maps, we created a web application. And this is now in its third iteration. What you're looking at is perhaps version 1 or version 2. It has been expanded, and now it covers other types of events, not just security threats. But there's another version of this that covers work on COVID from the security perspective. We also are engaged in the COVID response, as I suppose most humanitarian organizations are. but we are working with the COVAX initiative. And this is a very simplistic map. Actually, the work with COVAX is rather different. We're looking on preparedness and helping coordinate the distribution of vaccines in third world countries. But it is one of those key challenges that we were facing over the last 6 months or so. There are examples of the work. This was done by my colleague Hannah again, and it's on flooding in Bangladesh, where we used historical data for flooding to do geospatial analysis again on the topic of flooding, but with looking for predictive opportunities rather than just analysis of the past. I'm sorry, I'm quite aware of the time, so I'm somewhat rushing through things. Do stop me if you'd like me to dedicate a bit more time. Again, something of this new kind of product that we're doing more through data and analysis, predicting drought-related food insecurity. This was done with the team from OCHA for Ethiopia. So we helped them. It was a collaboration, so we helped them with the geospatial aspects and figuring out data sources that could actually address the requirement they had. And in the end, a report was produced. And finally, what challenges are we facing? And as I said, perhaps some of you might find this interesting, and perhaps you can contribute to it. I'd love for that to happen. So, complex problems. What do we mean? We used to live in a very easy world when it came to responding to emergencies. We just created maps. So 15, 20 years ago, almost, it was fairly easy. You created some basic mapping and there was nothing else. Increasingly, we are tackling ever more complex problems in the sector. And this is due to an ability in the sector to tackle them. So we are seeing data capability, GIS capability, an increased use of technology in the humanitarian sector, and that's a great thing. But it means that the problems that we're tackling now are far more complex. The problem of data quality is ever present, and I suppose that to you that is a very familiar territory. For us in the humanitarian sector, because we weren't so engaged with data work, sometimes it's a surprise. And sometimes it surprises even those people expecting problems. The fact that there was a very recent response in Guyana and Suriname because there was flooding, we could only help Guyana because Suriname was so data poor that we just couldn't. There was no way that we could effectively create even the most basic of maps with the data available for Suriname. So data gaps and data quality issues are still pervasive. And what we think we can do is help identify them. We can't always resolve them, but we can at least identify them quicker and highlight them to the right authorities and work with them and collaborate to make sure that they are addressed. Even the most basic available data would have been great for Suriname. Having figured out that there wasn't a basic set of boundary data, for example, an up-to-date set of boundary data, that would have been nice before the emergency. So going from data-driven insights to data-supported action is an important one for us. There's a lot of talk in the sector about anticipatory action and working mainly in preparedness, and that makes perfect sense. By the time you have to respond to something, it might already be too late. So if we can work on prevention, and if we can work on at least early triggers for some action, then the impact can be increased enormously. So we're definitely committed to becoming less of a reactive organization and much more of a proactive organization based on our data capability. Where to next?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to sort of cut you short there.
I'm sorry. This is actually my last slide.
Any questions? It's a compromise between questions and
This is actually the last slide, so I can happily stop here and open for questions.
Right.
Thanks, Juan. Has anyone got any questions? By the way, I thought it was a great presentation, amazing cause. And certainly, I know that we've got obviously some large organisations on the call today. I'm certainly a bit smaller in that sense, but I would certainly love to look at how we can contribute and help in that kind of sense. So I think it's a well worth cause. But yeah, I'll quickly open for any questions before we move on to our last speaker.
Juan, are you open to taking questions via email if someone comes up and wants to contact?
Of course, I'll type my email. I won't. You should have my email as I joined the call, but I will type my email in the chat window, so that you all have it.
That's great. Thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed all our speaking sessions today. We've got one more, hopefully really interesting. Keith McCormack from Cloud Factory. Keith, I know we're running slightly over, and I know you've got a stop time. So if you're able to fit that in, that would be perfect. But yeah, I'll pass over to Keith, and you should have access to be able to share screen from here.
Okay, great. I'll start sharing slides in a moment. Oh, I guess in WebEx we have the background anyway. Sometimes it's an issue of whether you're like a thumbnail or so on. But I can start the deck now, certainly. And good morning, good afternoon. Yeah, I apologize for the hard stop. I have a little bit of flexibility on it, but I'm in Manhattan at the moment, and I'm going to a meeting, and I have to give myself a little bit of transit time. There we go. We'll go full screen here. So what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to be talking about human in the loop, but my role at Cloud Factory is interesting because I continue to consult and kind of have this other half of my professional life, and my comments today are going to be kind of coming through both lenses. So let me tell you a little bit about me. Depending on how you want to start counting, I've been doing this kind of stuff 25, 30 years, but by that I mean, and I'm sure I have this in common with many of you, statistical modeling, traditional machine learning, things like that. So before joining Cloud Factory, and it's been less than a year, typical, machine learning engagement that I would be on would be something like insurance fraud or predictive maintenance or something in manufacturing. So since joining Cloud Factory, and I've maintained those, those consulting relationships, and I do various things like I teach a predictive analytics course with UC Irvine, and I've done some teaching on LinkedIn Learning. But again, that whole part of my professional life has been more traditional machine learning. So this last year has been a real eye-opener for the human in the loop side of the business. And again, I'm anticipating that I share this in common with many of you. If you've been around for a while, you've probably been around before deep learning was a thing. Okay, so some of my opening comments are going to be about how human in the loop and deep learning and very large data sets and all that stuff is arising at the same time. And it's really influenced certainly the direction that Cloud Factory has gone in. But again, it's been a very interesting eye-opener for me. So the quick version on Cloud Factory is that it's a managed external workforce. So in a very real sense, we are a human in the loop company. There's a large workforce in Nepal and also in Kenya. But I won't be primarily talking about all of that. I'll be talking about what's driving this need for large data sets. So again, I'm kind of wearing my machine learning modeling hat as much as I'm wearing my Cloud Factory hat today. So to try to keep things straightforward, I'm kind of reducing my comments to 3 basic observations, that I want to make about what I've learned about human in the loop over the last year. And it's been an evolving thing. Again, it's all caught up in also my experience of trying to sort out there in the world where deep learning is a good fit and where perhaps it's not. clearly for the stuff that Cloud Factory does, it's very much large data set deep learning things. But I'm going to take a few minutes to differentiate between those two worlds, because I think very often they get conflated, not so much by folks like us, but senior management, let's say, at companies where we might work, or at client companies. I think there's a lot of confusion about, where the hard work ends and the magic begins, or vice versa. So that's really going to be the nature of my comments. So let's start with the first of these three observations, and this is about the whole deep learning piece. And actually, my comments here are things that I started working about 2 or 3 years ago, when I was getting what I thought to be somewhat crazy questions from young data scientists that were saying, so Keith, does this basically mean that we should learn deep learning and nothing else? In other words, no statistics, no traditional machine learning, no decision trees, and so on. Is it going to be deep learning and only deep learning from here on in? Is it basically a waste of time to learn about any other approaches or any other algorithms? And I don't know if any of the rest of you have gotten that kind of question from young data scientists, but I do get approached and asked that at conferences. And I started to think, what's the best way to kind of address that question? It's also interesting through the lens of Cloud Factory, because Cloud Factory was founded just about 10 years ago now, but there was an earlier incarnation that takes its history slightly further back than that. What's interesting about that is it means that Cloud Factory has been around a little bit longer than deep learning has been as big an influence as it is. I won't have too much time to pursue that angle, but let's just kind of start with deep learning and scale and human in the loop. So I'm sure most of you will recognize her name. This is Fei-Fei Li. You very likely have seen the TED Talk that there's a screen grab here. So ImageNet is a very, very large data set of labeled images, as I'm sure many of you know. But the quote here is that, from Fei-Fei Li, is that it really was a sea change, is that folks didn't understand that what was going to happen was that the creation of these data sets was suddenly going to become the labor-intensive key part of the whole puzzle. And I really do think this was the moment that everything changed, because I can even kind of nail it down to a date, and you're going to see why in a couple of moments. It's really when George Hinton and his team won ImageNet in 2012. And I'd actually be curious when we get to Q&A if you agree. I think that by the time most of us were really hearing about it, unless you're a specialist in this area, was probably about 3 or 4 years later. It was really around 2015 or 2016 that I started noticing, whether it was on LinkedIn or discussions or at conferences, everybody was saying, oh gosh, if I don't learn deep learning, I'm going to be left behind. That's really when I started to feel it, and when I started to study these issues about what industries, what application areas were going to be impacted and what applications were perhaps going to stick with traditional machine learning, at least for some time. By the way, an interesting segue from Juan's comments to my own, I'm going to be quoting a human in the loop expert who has spent years in disaster response, coming in it more from NLP than geospatial, like looking at social media and so on to try to get a handle on what's going on in disaster areas. His name is Robert Monarch. But anyway, I found that very interesting one when you were talking about that aspect, because that's really where he got his start. And he was a guest on a LinkedIn Live that I do for Cloud Factory once a month. So I'll be mentioning him again. But if you have a particular interest in human in the loop, I urge you to seek out the interview that I did with Robert just a couple of months ago. It's out there on YouTube and on the Cloud Factory website, and it's definitely worth a listen. So here's the beginning of the struggle of me trying to decide what to say to these young data scientists that aren't particularly interested in, they could even be young data scientists in my class, for instance, that wonder, why would we want to learn about statistics and some of these other things? Isn't that hopelessly old school? Isn't everything, doesn't the algorithm do everything, right? And clearly it doesn't. But how do you walk somebody through that, right? So I always I always try to understand the mental image that somebody has. And I think that a lot of folks think that somehow the machine learning algorithms are learning like dogs or babies. You know, they're not only learning on their own, that somehow they're actors in the process and they're, you know, discovering things. And clearly it's not like this. So in traditional machine learning, what are we doing? Well, we're jumping through so many hoops, crafting the problem and doing things like data prep. And I've always felt that data annotation and data prep are really different things, and I find that people conflate those as well. But still, the basic principle is still there, is what is the computer doing and what is the human doing? So when I encounter folks that have this kind of almost magical thinking, understanding of machine learning and AI, I always think that probably what's going on is that they're confusing what most of AI does with reinforcement learning. And of course, reinforcement learning is going through a little bit of a renaissance, but you can go all the way back to the 50s and Arthur Samuels and the first tic-tac-toe program. But when you think about it, reinforcement learning creates the illusion that computers are learning, you know, something like this, where, you know, it's kind of the famous, Arthur Samuels is playing the tic-tac-toe, and initially he wins, but then his program gets better and eventually beats him. You know, I think that's the almost kind of romantic view of what's going on. But of course, the reality is more complicated than that. So here again is my case. I'll be curious to get your feedback when we get a chance to chat here, that this is really the turning point. Because if you listen to the interviews with George Hinton, and of course he just won the Turing Award a couple of years ago and so on, he and his Joshua Bengio and Jan LeCun, you know, share the prize. I think that was 3 years ago, maybe now. I feel like many of you, I'm sure, I feel like COVID was a bit of a time warp, and I've lost my sense of when things happened. Anyway, but only probably academics really noticed it in 2012. And if you see interviews with Hinton, he was working on deep learning going back to the 80s. But I think where we really started to hear it in our news feeds, in the newspaper, on LinkedIn, was about 3 or 4 years after this. So I also want to acknowledge another famous gentleman here. Cool YouTube video too that I encourage you to check out. Andrew Ng likes to use the metaphor of a rocket ship, that you can't have. You need the combination of a big rocket and a lot of fuel. One without the other isn't going to accomplish what's going on. Now, for those of us that have been at this for a while, that, you know, learned rules of thumb between sample size and parameters, those rules of thumb, of course, are largely out the window with deep learning, where you can have more parameters than cases, and that's not an uncommon situation at all. But nonetheless, in this little video that Andrew Ng does, he makes the case that it's all about scale. And then he backpedals slightly and he goes, well, it's almost all about scale. But then he really goes on to make a strong case that it is. And this is why I think for those of us that were playing around with neural nets in the 90s, you know, and after, a lot of times something as basic as a logistic regression would do nearly as well. But the difference is the confluence of all of these forces, the very large data sets, the faster machines, and the deep neural networks are making things happen that just weren't being successful before. You know, famous examples would include things like, Amazon Alexa, but I was just interviewing a gentleman on this same, Jonathan Reichenthal, on our monthly LinkedIn Live yesterday, and we were talking about autonomous vehicles. He was previously the chief information officer of Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. So he was in city government. So he is sufficiently optimistic about autonomous vehicles that he made the following claim yesterday, which I thought was remarkable. And I said, Robert, you know, you're going to be quoted on this. We're going to quote you on this. So we'll see what kind of comments he gets. He said that if you have, you know, a young child in your life, you know, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a son, a daughter, a niece, or a nephew, that they will probably never buy a car. That's a remarkable claim. Not everybody is as optimistic, perhaps, as he is, but he believes that because mixing autonomous vehicles with human drivers can be dangerous, you know, because they kind of operate on different rules and different principles. He thinks the mixture of the two technologies is where the risk lies. Therefore, the sooner we can get to 100% autonomous, the better. And then by extension, he says that probably the easiest way to do that is to basically have vehicles be something that we think of as more a public resource than a private one. So for instance, I'm sitting here in Manhattan, which explains the very bland wall and yellowish hue of the kind of lighting you get in a hotel room. He was suggesting that, you know, if he were to give advice to the mayor of New York, then maybe he would say, well, let's see how quickly we can get all the taxis to go autonomous. Which, if you visited New York, is a lot of the cars on the road. I mean, you're standing at the crosswalk, and sometimes it seems like all the cars that are going past you are taxis. So New York is really unique in that way. Anyway, so we digress a bit, but you can see where I'm going with this. This has completely changed these other areas, but these application areas, speech understanding and generation, autonomous vehicles, and so on, are incredibly data hungry, and that's why this is all connected. These technologies and these algorithms need lots of data, and specifically, it's not primarily unsupervised and reinforcement learning that we're doing. All that's happening too, but the vast majority of work in deep learning has been supervised learning. So there you go. If deep learning needs huge data sets, and if deep learning is primarily supervised learning, you need a ton of annotated data. And that's why there's now a whole ecosystem to support the labeling of very large supervised learning data sets. And Cloud Factory is part of that, but it's really rapidly growing and rapidly changing for all these reasons. This is something that I borrowed from a source online. Certainly, if anybody wants that link in chat, but you should be able to find it. I find this absolutely remarkable. So again, I've made the claim that in 2012 everything changed, even if it took 2 or 3 years for most of us to hear about it. Well, if you look, the big difference was between the ImageNet competition in 2010 and 2011. There was no major change between the nature of what they did. You know, shallow here means a shallow neural net. So just a couple of hidden layers. Okay. So then George Hinton wins in 2012. And look at the explosion between 2012 and 2015. And 2015 was a few years ago now. I don't have a graphic handy on where we've gone, but I'm sure it hasn't gone back down. So that's observation one, that human in the loop and deep learning are really married, really tied at the hip. Okay. Here's where I want to talk about Robert. Okay. So something that's been a real eye opener for me since joining Cloud Factory is I've started to dig deeper into this whole human in the loop ecosystem, which again was fairly new to me. I kind of was aware it existed, but I hadn't really invested a lot of professional development in human in the loop before Cloud Factory. And the reason is, if you're doing things like insurance fraud or predictive maintenance or loan default, I mean, the classic decades old traditional machine learning application areas, you're mostly working with structured data. So, prior to the last year, when I was dealing with unstructured data, more often than not, it was text mining, text analytics, maybe even a little bit of sentiment analysis sprinkled in there, but not primarily video or images. And those are the big areas for a company like Cloud Factory. So I'm digging in, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say this now because it seems very naive. But if you asked me a year ago, I probably would have imagined that human in the loop was a fairly passive type thing. There's the image, you draw the bounding box, and you do that a whole bunch of times, and you've got your data set. And it's a lot more complicated than I gave it credit. And everybody that I talk to, and the more that I investigate into this, it really is its own area of expertise. And I wouldn't be surprised over time if there are folks that basically build a career specifically around this skill set. Just like over the years, I've encountered people that, they have econometrics or finance backgrounds, and they might be aware of other algorithms and other things, but they mostly do time series, or, there are folks that specialize in different areas. I really do think it's not just a skill within machine learning, it's a major area of expertise. And let me give you a sense of why that's the case. I'm not a big fan of slide builds, so I just click them all in there. So I think for a lot of folks, the data annotation, oh, sorry about that. That was my alarm telling me to wake up. I usually wake up at 7:30 a.m. It just turned 7:30. So again, I think kind of the naive view perhaps that I would have had a year or two ago about human in the loop is it's mostly on the front end. And if that's always been your impression, you're in good company. Most people probably focus on that area, but there's all kinds of subspecialties within human in the loop. Now, you can look at this in a couple of different ways. You've got the level of expertise that the data annotators themselves develop, and I want to comment on that. But also at the moment, I'm more focused on the management of the process. For instance, there's an area of human in the loop called active learning, which is something like stratified sampling. But what you're doing is you're trying to identify those cases that need annotation that will be the most important and the most fruitful cases to give your attention to. Just as a pollster uses stratified sampling to say which cases are we missing that we need more cases of, and oversamples or stratifies. Should we, I know this was when we were supposed to switch to Q&A, but I just noticed that is this kind of a milestone in the day's agenda? Did some people have a hard stop that just passed?
It's lunchtime here, Keith.
Yeah.
And we actually haven't had a comfort break either. So I think the two things combined. They also know this is being recorded.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's no one's going to miss anything if they do dip out.
Oh no, I totally understand. I just wanted to do a quick agenda check to make sure when
Yeah,
because occasionally when I'm teaching all day seminars, I have to be aware of that because I'll glance down at my watch and say, "Oh my gosh, it's been 2 hours and there hasn't been a break." So again, this is throughout the process, not just on the front end. And when I was reading Robert Monarch's book, 400-page book on running human in the loop projects, I did not anticipate the amount of math, for instance, right? And he puts it this way. He says, most traditional machine learning, I think he's thinking like, things like a linear regression, decision tree, so on. He said, most of that is high school math. And to be honest, I would agree, because you're not really using, calculus, and some of that's going on behind the scenes, but a lot of it is just a little bit more than arithmetic, But some of the stuff that he is doing for quality control, and when he uses this active learning technique, is more like college math. You would think it's very, very simple. You just draw the boxes and move on, but you're doing this on a very large scale, and you're checking for bias. So there's more going on than you might anticipate, and it's throughout the AI life cycle more than you would anticipate. So here's the quote from Robert, and this is actually from his book, but I interviewed him, gosh, I'm losing track of time. I guess it was in May. Hard to believe, because I just had an interview yesterday and I had one in between. Yeah, so I was back in May that I interviewed Robert, and we talked for an hour about human in the loop. It was absolutely fantastic. And I shared this quote from his book and then asked him to respond to it. So, see, the issue in the human in the loop world is that generally it's seen that you have three choices as to who's going to do the data annotation. I found it fascinating trying to better understand the trade-offs between these choices. So there's crowdsourcing, which, by the way, was how ImageNet was done, and a lot of times in the academic arena, because ImageNet was being done at Stanford, that's largely the choice. I'm sure it's a budget issue, among other things. Then you have kind of the world that Cloud Factory lives in, which is not an expert in the sense that they're not medical doctors, they're not PhDs in agronomy, right? They don't have that kind of subject matter expertise, but they have this other kind of expertise that Robert is talking about. And then finally, there's what is often called expert in the loop. That's when you have the radiologist look at the X-ray. You have the PhD or the engineer, look at something. So the problem is, obviously, that you can't scale the experts. But what's fascinating is that it goes deeper than that. It's not only that you can't scale the experts, it's that the experts bring their subject matter expert lens to the physical perception of what they're annotating. And they will sometimes perceive things differently. Their expertise will allow them to perceive things that a non-expert might miss, but conversely, their expertise will sometimes cause them to not attend to what would be considered extraneous details or edge cases in a way that an expert annotator that's not a subject matter expert brings a very different psychology to the task. So when I first started chatting with one of the experts at Cloud Factory about this, I became so interested and so intrigued, because what they did is they explained that sometimes the annotators will do better than medical students. And you wonder, well, what's going on? Then you kind of contemplate the reality of the situation. A medical student you might only get for a couple of weeks or a few weeks during their summer holiday, right? Because they're in medical school after all, right? So you think that their subject matter expertise is going to be a help, and on a certain level it is. Like sometimes when you're prototyping, when you're in the design and build, you want to be involved in the subject matter experts. But sometimes you have to move on for these two reasons. One is, again, you can't scale them. Two, I think it's partly personality, frankly. I think not everybody can spend a year looking at, plants or satellite data, and so on, and annotating in this way. I think I would probably be quite poor at it. So what happens is folks that are good at this, if they spend many weeks doing it, they often become better at the subject matter expert because they've developed an expertise in the task. And again, I found that striking when I first encountered it, but I keep on learning that lesson over and over again when I talk to experts about this. I just grabbed a case study that was something that I could share just to give you a notion of what this is like. These are the kinds of images that folks are looking at. And, the goal of the analysis obviously is to ultimately find out what plants need pesticide, which plants are healthy, which ones aren't, and so on, identifying different types, separating the difference between a plant and a weed, the whole 9 yards, right? So it's very, very detailed work. And with skill and with practice, you get faster and faster at it. But those are the kinds of images that a data annotator would be working with. You're kind of looking at the before and after there. Before the brighter green is they've done what they had to make sure that everything's properly labeled. Okay. I meant to say data science education. Okay. So hopefully everybody will catch that in the recording that this, I intended this slide to say data science education. So the issue here is, and both Robert said that as well as my colleague that I've gotten to know a bit, Usama Fayyad, whose name you might recognize because he's been at this for a very long time and is a very influential guy. But he's just accepted a new role at, and by the way, I'm going to be wrapping up in about 2 or 3 minutes, which means that I think I've made back a couple minutes of time, and then I think we can still do 10 minutes of Q&A, right, if there are some folks that have questions. And I think we'll still be in good shape. Okay, so both Robert and Usama mentioned the same kind of thing, and that is that professional data scientists, newly minted ones we're talking about, but we're talking about like Stanford PhDs, we're talking about the elite, right, are arriving in the workplace usually with no classroom exposure to this kind of work, this kind of data work. And it has a bigger impact than you might anticipate, certainly than I would have anticipated. So in Robert's book, not Usama now, but back to Robert. In Robert's book, he talks about a situation where a US car manufacturer, he doesn't say the name of the car manufacturer, and you'll understand why he didn't say the name in a moment. But anyway, this car manufacturer hired about 6 or 8 data science PhDs, obviously knew their autonomous vehicles, they knew their algorithms, they knew their stuff, right? I mean, these were top-notch talents. But they had underestimated how much work was involved in creating good training data sets. And, you know, I asked Robert if he thought the reason is that they probably got classroom training on some of the things that I've been up to for 25 years, like traditional techniques and structured data. And he said, you know, I hadn't really looked at it. He said, I haven't really reflected on it through that lens, but there's probably some truth to that. But he said, you know, I just know that they were ill prepared, right? So they were top-notch candidates. They were hired. This was a whole team of them. Again, not just 1 or 2. This is like 6 or 8 PhDs. 6 months later, the project was so off the rails, so problematic that the whole team was let go, and they had to hire a whole new team because they just hadn't been looking for the right skill set when they hired. And Usama recognizes this as well. Now, Usama's an interesting guy because he's more kind of an entrepreneur than Robert. He's had startups and startups that were bought out. So the quick bio on Usama is that when he finished grad school about 30 years ago, he was one of the first. He was the first co-chair of the KDD conference, the Knowledge Discovery and Database Conference. So he basically helped found that conference, which is now 25 years old. And then he was at Jet Propulsion Laboratories, so very much coming at this from an academic angle. Then he had a startup that was bought out. He has a huge resume. But he had a startup that was bought out by Yahoo and became the world's first chief data officer. And apparently it started out as a joke. They said, okay, Usama, what should your title be? And he said, well, apparently I'm going to be in charge of data. So I guess I'm the chief data officer. Right? Anyway, it was just a joke in a meeting, but everybody decided it had a ring to it, and that was him. So he was the first chief data officer back in the 90s and did that for a while, and now he consults, but he's recently taken a role, and this is why I had to kind of lead up to his resume a bit. He's the inaugural director of a graduate program at Northeastern, and he's doing that concurrent with his other responsibilities. But this is where the quote is coming from, is that he feels that data science needs something like a medical student residency. You graduate from medical school and then you do your residency, right? And I think that's absolutely brilliant. So he's making the case in this quote that without that apprentice-based learning, you know, you're going to be out of luck. So I asked him about what Robert said a month earlier, and he said, absolutely, no one's learning the data side in the classroom. And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be added to the classroom curriculum, in data science, but certainly it has to be addressed in some way. And at the moment, he feels the best short-term fix is apprenticeship. And I happen to agree with him. So there you have it. Three ways to stay in touch. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Obviously, you can follow Cloud Factory on LinkedIn, but I also encourage you to check out the webinars that I was just describing, because they really have been so rewarding professionally for me. Yesterday, I interviewed Jonathan Reichenthal about smart cities. The month before was Osama. The month before was Robert Monik. And then there were 3 more before that were less on the topic of human in the loop. So I didn't mention them in the talk. But that's the best way to find out more about me and more about those speakers. So hope that was interesting for everybody, and I would gladly take questions. And we had planned on finishing around this time, but not to worry. I have at least 5 to 10 minutes.
Great, thanks, Keith. It was a great talk. I particularly loved the end. I'm a big fan of apprenticeships, and I know Tim, who if he was here, would be talking the same. So I'll just open up to the floor to see if there's any questions. No, I know that we've kept it going straight through, but it's been some really fascinating talks today. So look, thanks for all of our speakers. And yeah, naturally, Keith, are you happy that anyone reaches out separately and asks any questions afterwards, particularly for those that are just going to be watching the recording?
Yeah. Well, especially since we are still recording, this is my best way to talk to the folks that aren't here. So I would say, I would suggest the following. Add me on LinkedIn, can certainly follow me on LinkedIn, and that doesn't require any correspondence or anything. So follow me and follow Cloud Factory. That's what I would recommend. The second thing that I would recommend is that if somebody wants to chat, go ahead and anyone in this group certainly can reach out and send me a connection request. But because I do some teaching for LinkedIn Learning, I get a ton of connection requests, right? Because there's a large volume of folks that see that. So what I ask folks to do is if they do want to chat, go ahead and do that. But then send me a message, or how when you add something on LinkedIn, you can add the little note. In other words, just say, I caught your talk and recording, for the data analyst user group, right? And again, it's not like a secret password. It's just to help get through the noise of the dozens of connection requests I get a week. And actually what will happen is if 2 or 3 people do that, then I'll start to notice that they're connected to other people, and it will help me, because again, I get a large volume of those. So I appreciate people being patient with that. But just send me a chat, and then I'm on LinkedIn almost every day, so you might even catch me live. But what I would also be glad to do is, because of the way the agenda fell out today, that if you have another meeting, coming up, and we just figure out a time that makes sense, I could, in a month or something like that, I could just jump in, sit in for a few minutes, and then we could just add 15 minutes of Q&A, with me to the agenda. I extend that offer only if more people end up seeing this and recording than perhaps saw it just now.
Lovely. Thank you, Keith.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Right, we've come to the end. I've actually got Tim's introduction on YouTube, but I'm not going to take up any more time with Tim's introduction. If you're looking at the recording, you will see that Tim's introduction is actually at the front of this recording. And if you stayed this long, you'll understand that we had issues at the beginning and Tim's introduction was never shown. So that will top and tail the confusion, so that you won't have any idea that we didn't see Tim's introduction while we were live. But we didn't see Tim's introduction while we were live, but you watched it on screen. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. It's difficult to know how long to then make these meetings last, and how long to have for the presentations. We didn't do this right. Each of our presentations could have gone on for much longer, but I don't think we could have.
Oh.
I think the balance is we needed less speakers and more time. It's really difficult. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in real time.
Well, you've
very
just
soon.
about hit the 3-hour mark, right? You've been at this for almost 3 hours, and because of the issues, you went 3 hours without a break. Yeah, so that's yeah.
Gary and I were on earlier than that, so yeah, I think we're all due a very strong cup of coffee and a comfort break. So I will thank everybody for coming. I will be following up with emails on things that were outstanding that we discussed, and have a fantastic weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks all. Thanks all our speakers. It's great event.
Okay, take care. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.